Welcome, fellow dreamer. Tonight, we journey through the enchanting world of theatre, tracing its path from the sunlit amphitheaters of ancient Greece to the candlelit stages of medieval mystery plays, discovering how humanity has always found magic in the art of storytelling through performance. This narration is woven together with calming music and gentle abstract imagery, designed to quietly reveal captivating wonders and delightful curiosities about stagecraft and drama, nourishing your mind with fascinating tales as you ease into peaceful rest. So take a deep breath, settle into the softness around you, and allow your thoughts to quiet and your eyes to grow heavy as this story of theatrical artistry unfolds before you. In the soft twilight of ancient Greece, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the people of Athens gathered for something extraordinary. They came from their homes and workshops, from the agora where they debated and the fields where they labored, drawn together by a collective yearning that had begun to stir in the heart of their civilization. This was the 6th century before the Common Era, a time when the world was young and the art of theatre was about to be born. The story of theatre begins not in a building or on a stage as we might imagine it today, but in the open air, on hillsides where communities assembled to honor Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and transformation. These gatherings were sacred occasions, moments when the boundary between the everyday world and the realm of the divine seemed to grow thin. The worship of Dionysus was unlike the formal ceremonies dedicated to other gods. It was ecstatic, joyful, and deeply communal, filled with music and dance that allowed participants to lose themselves in something greater than their individual existence. At the center of these early festivals were the dithyrambs, choral hymns sung by groups of men who moved in synchronized patterns while they chanted verses praising the god. Picture these choruses, perhaps 50 voices strong, dressed in simple garments, their faces earnest as they told stories of Dionysus and his miraculous deeds. The rhythm of their words matched the rhythm of their steps, creating a hypnotic effect that could transport both performers and witnesses into a state of collective rapture. These were not merely songs, but communal prayers, expressions of gratitude and reverence that bound the community together through shared experience. But something remarkable began to happen within these religious celebrations. The human imagination, restless and creative, started to push beyond the traditional boundaries. Someone, perhaps driven by inspiration or divine madness, stepped forward from the chorus to speak as an individual voice. This moment, lost to us in the mists of time, represents one of the most significant transformations in cultural history. When that first performer separated himself from the group to answer the chorus, to engage in a kind of exchange, drama, as we understand it, was conceived. The ancient sources credit a man named Thespis with this revolutionary act. His name has come down to us across more than 25 centuries, and from it we derive our word for actors, thespians. Little is known with certainty about Thespis himself. He was said to have traveled from place to place with his chorus, performing his innovative presentations on a cart that served as a mobile stage. Whether this detail is historical fact or pleasant legend remains uncertain. But the innovation attributed to him is clear. By introducing a speaker who could dialogue with the chorus, Thespis created the essential dynamic of theatrical performance. The interplay between individual voice and collective response, between character and commentary. This development represented more than a technical innovation in performance. It reflected something profound about the evolving Greek understanding of human nature and society. The emergence of a solo performer, distinct from the chorus, mirrored the growing Greek interest in individual identity and personal responsibility. In the democratic polis of Athens, citizens were learning to think of themselves as individuals with unique perspectives and voices, even as they remained part of the larger civic body. Theatre became a space where this tension between individual and community could be explored and celebrated. The city Dionysia, the great festival held each spring in Athens, became the primary venue for these theatrical experiments. This was no small local celebration, but a major civic event that drew visitors from across the Greek world. For several days, the normal business of the city paused, and attention turned to the performances staged in honor of Dionysus. The festival included processions, sacrifices, and ritual celebrations, but increasingly, the dramatic competitions became its centerpiece, the moment when Athens displayed its cultural achievements to citizens and foreigners alike. The religious dimension of these early theatrical events cannot be overstated. The performances were offerings to the god, acts of devotion as meaningful as any sacrifice or prayer. The theatre was sacred ground, and those who attended came not merely as audience members, but as participants in a religious observance. The stories presented often dealt with mythological themes, tales of gods and heroes that carried profound meaning for Greek spiritual life. Through these performances, the community confronted questions about fate, justice, the relationship between mortals and immortals, and the proper conduct of human life. Yet these performances also served civic and educational purposes. In the democracy of Athens, citizens needed to think carefully about questions of right action, about the conflicts that could arise between competing goods, about the consequences of human choices. The theatrical performances provided a unique space for exploring these questions in a way that was simultaneously emotional and intellectual. By watching actors embody characters facing difficult dilemmas, the Athenian audience could reflect on similar challenges in their own lives and in their community's governance. The simplicity of these early productions might surprise us. There were no elaborate sets, no sophisticated lighting effects, no recorded music or amplified sound. The power of the performance came from the human voice, from the movement of bodies in space, from masks that transformed the familiar into the extraordinary, and from words carefully chosen to move and enlighten. In this simplicity lay great strength. Without technological mediation, the connection between performer and witness was direct and immediate, an exchange of energy and attention that created meaning in the moment. As these festivals continued year after year, the art form grew more sophisticated. The stories became more complex, the performances more nuanced, the emotional range more expansive. What had begun as an elaboration of ritual hymns was evolving into something new, a distinct art form with its own conventions and possibilities. The Greeks were discovering that theatre could hold a mirror up to human experience, reflecting both the glories and the struggles of mortal existence. And so the foundation was laid. In those gathering spaces on Athenian hillsides, with the spring sun warming the stone seats and the scent of wine and flowers in the air, Western theatre was born. From religious devotion and communal celebration emerged an art form that would spread across the Mediterranean world and echo down through the centuries, continually reinventing itself while maintaining a connection to these origins. The structures that would soon rise to house these performances would become architectural marvels, designed to perfect and enhance the theatrical experience that was already capturing the imagination of ancient Greece. As theatrical performance took root in ancient Greece, the need arose for spaces worthy of this emerging art form. The Greeks, with their remarkable gift for combining functionality with beauty, created architectural wonders that would serve as gathering places for entire communities. These structures were not merely buildings, but carefully designed instruments that transformed the simple act of watching a performance into something transcendent. The earliest theatres in Greece were humble affairs, simple wooden platforms set in natural hollows where the earth itself formed a gentle slope. Spectators would stand or sit upon the hillside, watching performances unfold below. But as the popularity of theatrical festivals grew, particularly those honoring Dionysus, the Greeks began to envision something grander. They looked to the landscape around them and saw opportunity in the natural contours of the land. The theatre of Dionysus in Athens stands as perhaps the most significant of these early structures. Nestled into the southern slope of the Acropolis, this theatre evolved gradually over centuries, beginning as a simple dancing circle with temporary wooden seating in the 6th century before the Common Era. The location itself held sacred meaning, situated near the Temple of Dionysus, where the god of wine and theatre was worshipped. As the festivals grew more elaborate and the audiences larger, the Athenians transformed this space into a permanent stone structure. Imagine standing at the base of the Acropolis on a festival day, joining a stream of fellow citizens making their way to the theatre. The morning air carries the excitement of thousands gathering for a full day of performances. You climb the stone steps, finding your place among the semicircular rows of seats that rise up the hillside like a great fan opening toward the heavens. Below you, the circular orchestra, the dancing floor where the chorus would perform, lies like a pristine disk of packed earth. At its center stands an altar to Dionysus, reminding all present of the sacred origins of the spectacle about to unfold. The design of these theatres reflected a deep understanding of both human nature and natural physics. The semicircular shape, what the Greeks called the theatron, meaning the seeing place, ensured that every spectator had a clear view of the performance area. The rows of stone seats, called the koilon or hollow, wrapped around the orchestra in concentric arcs, rising steeply to maximize sightlines while bringing the back rows closer to the action than a flat arrangement ever could. But the true genius of Greek theatre architecture revealed itself through sound. The theatre of Epidaurus built in the 4th century before the Common Era in the sanctuary of Asclepius, demonstrates this acoustic mastery with breathtaking clarity. Even today, visitors marvel at how a coin dropped in the center of the orchestra can be heard distinctly in the uppermost rows, some 55 meters away. Modern acoustic researchers have studied this phenomenon extensively, discovering that the limestone seats and their careful arrangement create a natural filter that reduces low-frequency background noise while allowing the higher frequencies of the human voice to travel with remarkable clarity. The architects achieved this acoustic perfection without the benefit of modern scientific instruments or computer modeling. They relied instead on careful observation, experimentation, and an intimate understanding of how sound moves through space. The gradual slope of the seating, the materials chosen for construction, the dimensions of the orchestra. All these elements worked in harmony to create an auditory experience that remains unmatched by many modern venues. The theatre of Epidaurus could accommodate approximately 14,000 spectators, yet a person speaking in a normal voice from the orchestra could be heard throughout the entire space. This was no small achievement when we consider that actors wore masks that covered their entire faces. The design of the theatre itself became a partner in the performance, amplifying and clarifying the voices of the performers so that every word, every nuance of delivery could reach even those seated in the highest rows. The physical layout of these theatres also reflected the evolving nature of dramatic performance. Behind the orchestra, the Greeks eventually constructed the scheme, a building that served multiple purposes. Initially a simple tent or hut where actors could change costumes and masks between appearances, the scheme grew more elaborate over time, becoming a permanent stone structure with a decorated facade that could represent a palace, temple, or other building as the play required. The space between the orchestra and the scheme, called the paraskenia, created side entrances through which actors and chorus members could enter and exit. These architectural elements were not arbitrary, but responded to the practical needs of performance. The scheme's facade, the proskenion, provided a background for the action and a surface from which voices could reflect back toward the audience, further enhancing acoustics. Its presence also created a clear distinction between the visible world of the performance and the hidden space where theatrical transformations occurred, adding an element of mystery and possibility to each production. As you settle into your stone seat, the marble warmed by the Mediterranean sun, you become part of a living democracy of art. The theatre welcomes citizens from all walks of life, bringing together rich and poor, merchant and farmer, young and old. The tickets, distributed by the state, ensured that even those with modest means could participate in this cultural celebration. The architecture itself reinforced this democratic spirit, with its semicircular embrace suggesting equality among spectators, all focused together on the common experience unfolding before them. The open-air design connected audiences directly to the natural world. Performances took place in daylight, typically beginning in the early morning and continuing through the afternoon. The sky formed a boundless ceiling. Clouds drifted overhead, and the changing quality of sunlight subtly altered the mood as the day progressed. Birds might wing across the vista, and distant hills formed a natural backdrop to the human drama playing out in the orchestra below. This integration with nature was intentional, reminding audiences that the stories being told were part of a larger cosmic order. These great stone theatres stood as monuments to the Greek belief in the power of collective experience. Unlike private entertainment, theatre was a public art, something to be shared with one's fellow citizens. The architecture facilitated this sharing, creating spaces where thousands could gather as one, to laugh together, weep together, and contemplate together the great questions of existence that the plays explored. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the theatre, as the final words of the day's performances echoed through the perfectly designed space, the audience would file out through the carefully planned passages, carrying with them not just memories of the stories they had witnessed, but the profound experience of having been part of something larger than themselves, held within the stone embrace of architectural genius. The morning sun would rise over ancient Athens, casting long shadows across the great amphitheaters as actors prepared for the day's performances. Before they could step onto the stage and bring their characters to life, these performers faced a remarkable transformation. They would don the most distinctive elements of Greek theatrical tradition, the iconic masks and elaborate costumes that would define their craft for generations to come. Imagine standing backstage in the theatre of Dionysus, surrounded by these mysterious objects. The masks hung on the walls like silent faces waiting to speak, each one carved and painted with exquisite care. These weren't mere decorations or simple disguises. They were essential tools of communication, serving multiple purposes that made Greek theatre possible on such a grand scale. The masks themselves were works of considerable artistry. Craftsmen constructed them primarily from stiffened linen, a material light enough to wear for hours, yet sturdy enough to maintain its shape throughout vigorous performances. The process of creating these masks required patience and skill. Layers of linen would be molded over a form, then reinforced and painted. Some masks incorporated cork or lightweight wood for structural elements. The result was a covering that enclosed the entire head of the actor, transforming them completely into their character. Each mask bore exaggerated features designed to be visible from the furthest seats in those vast amphitheaters. The eyes were opened wide, the mouths shaped into expressions of joy, sorrow, anger, or fear. These weren't subtle expressions meant for intimate viewing. They were bold, clear statements of emotion that could be read by thousands of spectators at once, even those seated in the highest rows, where individual actors might appear quite small against the massive stage. The practical advantages of mass extended beyond visibility. In the warm Mediterranean climate, voices needed to project across enormous distances without modern amplification. The masks may have helped with this challenge. The mouth opening, some scholars believe, could have acted as a kind of megaphone, helping to direct and amplify the actor's voice outward toward the audience. The shape of the mask around the mouth might have contributed to the remarkable acoustics that made Greek theatre audible throughout these great spaces. Another crucial function of masks related to the constraints of Greek theatrical production. A typical tragedy or comedy employed only a small number of actors, often just 2 or 3 performers. Yet the plays required many more characters. An actor might play multiple roles within a single production, stepping off stage to exchange one mask for another, instantly becoming a different person. This quick transformation allowed for greater complexity in storytelling, while working within practical limitations. The masks also served a deeper symbolic purpose. They created a separation between the performer and the character, allowing the audience to see beyond the individual actor to the universal human experiences being portrayed. A king, a beggar, a god, or a monster could all be brought to life with equal conviction. The mask was the character, independent of whoever wore it. The costumes that accompanied these masks were equally important to the theatrical spectacle. Actors wore long, flowing robes that helped establish their character's status and identity. Tragic actors donned the dignified chiton and himation, garments familiar to Greek audiences, but often elaborated with rich colors and decorative patterns. Purple might indicate royalty, while darker colors could suggest mourning or misfortune. To enhance their presence on the vast stage, tragic actors wore special platform boots called kothornoi, which added height and gravity to their appearance. These elevated shoes helped the performers command attention in the enormous theatrical space, making their movements more visible and lending them an almost superhuman quality, appropriate for the mythological heroes and gods they often portrayed. Walking in such footwear required practice and skill, but the effect was undeniably powerful. Comic actors dressed quite differently. Their costumes featured padding that created exaggerated, grotesque body shapes, reflecting comedy's emphasis on the physical and ridiculous aspects of human nature. Their masks bore equally absurd features, with wide grins or foolish expressions. The costume designer for a comedy had freedom to create wild, imaginative outfits that emphasized satire and humor. Behind the actors stood the skene, a structure that evolved from a simple tent or hut into an elaborate stage building. This architectural element served multiple theatrical purposes. At its most basic level, it provided a backdrop for the action and a place where actors could change masks and costumes between scenes. The wooden facade could be painted to suggest different locations: a palace, a temple, a cave, or a forest. The skene also allowed for entrances and exits that carried meaning. Characters emerging from the central door of the skene typically came from the main building represented in the scene. Whether a royal palace or a humble dwelling, the space atop the skene, called the theologian, provided a platform where gods could appear, literally above the human action below. This physical elevation reinforced the hierarchical relationship between divine and mortal characters. Greek theatre also employed certain mechanical devices that expanded storytelling possibilities. The ekkyklema was a wheeled platform that could be rolled out from the skene to reveal interior scenes, particularly tableaus of violence or death that occurred off stage according to Greek dramatic convention. The mechane, essentially a crane-like device, allowed actors portraying gods to be lifted into the air and flown over the stage, creating spectacular divine interventions. This machine gave us the term Deus ex machina, the god from the machine, referring to the convention of divine characters arriving to resolve seemingly impossible situations. These technical and visual elements of Greek theatre work together to create a complete artistic experience. The masks allowed for clear character recognition and swift transformations. The costumes established social hierarchies and dramatic tone. The skene provided context and enabled staging effects. All of these components supported the fundamental purpose of the performance: telling stories that explored the deepest questions of human existence, the relationship between mortals and gods, and the forces of fate and choice that shaped lives. As darkness settled over the theatres and the performances concluded, the masks would be carefully stored away, waiting for the next festival, the next play, the next opportunity to bring drama to life. These objects of wood and linen and paint carried within them the power to transform and transport, to make visible the invisible, and to give voice to the eternal human experiences that theatre sought to illuminate. The masks had been crafted, the costumes prepared, and the stone seats of the amphitheatre filled with expectant citizens. As the Greek theatrical tradition matured through the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era, it awaited someone who would transform it from ritual spectacle into something recognizably dramatic. That transformative figure emerged in the person of Aeschylus, a man whose innovations would fundamentally reshape the nature of theatrical performance and earn him recognition as the father of tragedy. Born around 525 BCE in Eleusis, a town near Athens known for its sacred mysteries, Aeschylus lived during one of history's most extraordinary periods. He witnessed the birth of Athenian democracy, fought in the Persian wars at Marathon and possibly Salamis, and saw his city rise to become the cultural center of the Greek world. These experiences would profoundly influence his dramatic vision, infusing his plays with themes of justice, civic responsibility, and the relationship between mortals and the divine. Before Aeschylus made his crucial innovations, Greek tragedy consisted primarily of a chorus performing rhythmic songs and dances, with a single actor stepping forward occasionally to engage in dialogue with the chorus leader. This format, while powerful in its own right, limited the dramatic possibilities. The performances remained more ceremonial than truly theatrical, more ritual recitation than enacted story. What Aeschylus understood, with an insight that would echo through theatrical history, was that drama requires conflict, and conflict requires interaction between characters who can challenge, oppose, and respond to one another. His revolutionary solution appeared elegantly simple yet profoundly consequential. Aeschylus introduced a second actor to the stage. This innovation, seemingly modest, fundamentally altered the nature of theatrical performance. With two actors present simultaneously, true dialogue became possible. Characters could now disagree, argue, persuade, and react to one another in real time before the audience. The chorus, rather than dominating the performance, could step back and observe, comment, and reflect upon the unfolding action. Drama, as we understand it today, essentially began in this moment. The addition of this second performer created new possibilities for dramatic structure and storytelling. Aeschylus could now present conflicts between individuals, rather than simply between a character and fate or the gods. He could show different perspectives on events, allowing the audience to witness arguments unfold and tensions build. The theatre became a space where ideas could clash, and where human decisions could be weighed and examined through the interactions of distinct voices. Of the approximately 90 plays Aeschylus is believed to have written, only 7 complete works survive to our time. Among these, the Oresteia trilogy stands as his masterwork, and the only complete tragic trilogy that has come down to us from ancient Greece. Performed in 458 BCE, just 2 years before his death. This monumental work traces the curse upon the house of Atreus through 3 interconnected plays: Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides. The Orestia demonstrates Aeschylus at the height of his powers, weaving together themes of justice, revenge, and the evolution from blood vengeance to civic law. The trilogy begins with the return of King Agamemnon from the Trojan War and his subsequent murder by his wife Clytemnestra. It continues through their son Orestes' terrible dilemma, as he must choose between avenging his father by killing his mother or leaving the crime unpunished. The final play resolves these tensions by establishing the Areopagus, Athens' court of law, suggesting that cycles of revenge can be broken through communal systems of justice. Throughout his works, Aeschylus displayed a grandeur of vision and language that matched the scope of his themes. His poetry possessed a weight and majesty that audiences found both beautiful and awe-inspiring. He did not shy from depicting the gods as active participants in human affairs, yet his plays consistently explored how humans navigate their choices within the constraints imposed by fate and divine will. His characters face genuine moral dilemmas, where competing obligations create impossible situations, forcing both protagonists and audiences to grapple with profound questions about duty, honor, and righteousness. The physical staging of Aeschylean drama reflected his innovative spirit. He expanded the use of the skene, that backdrop building behind the performance space, employing it more creatively for entrances and exits and to suggest interior spaces. He understood the visual power of theatre, creating memorable stage pictures that enhanced the emotional impact of his words. Ancient accounts credit him with introducing more elaborate costumes, and perhaps even the elevated footwear that would later become associated with tragic actors. Aeschylus also recognized the importance of spectacle in creating powerful theatrical experiences. While later critics sometimes characterized his work as old-fashioned compared to his successors, contemporary audiences found his productions thrilling. He employed the mechani, a crane-like device that could lift actors into the air to represent gods descending from Olympus. He created moments of startling theatrical effect, such as the entrance of the Furies in the Eumenides, which ancient sources suggest was so frightening that it caused audience members to faint. Yet beneath the spectacle lay serious purpose. Aeschylus used theatre as a vehicle for exploring the most pressing concerns of his community. His plays examined questions of war and peace, particularly relevant to Athenians who had recently defended their city against Persian invasion. They investigated the nature of justice and how societies might move from primitive revenge toward more evolved legal systems. They pondered the relationship between individual will and cosmic order, between human agency and divine plan. The playwright's military service informed his work in subtle but significant ways. The Persian, one of his earliest surviving plays, depicts the Greek victory over Persia from the Persian perspective, an unusual choice that demonstrates his ability to find universal human themes even in depicting Athens' enemies. The play, performed only 8 years after the actual Battle of Salamis, where Aeschylus may have fought, shows remarkable empathy in portraying the grief and devastation experienced by the defeated Persians. When Aeschylus died around 456 BCE, probably in Sicily, where he had traveled later in life, he left behind a transformed art form. The second actor he had introduced became standard practice, and his successor, Sophocles, would add a third, building upon the foundation Aeschylus had established. The grandeur of his language, the seriousness of his themes, and the moral weight of his dramas set the standard by which subsequent tragedians would be measured. Legend holds that Aeschylus chose an epitaph for himself that mentioned nothing of his theatrical achievements, referring instead only to his military service at Marathon. Whether this story reflects historical truth or later invention, it captures something essential about the man. He lived in an age when citizenship meant active participation in the polis, when the boundary between public and private life remained fluid, and when art served the community by helping it understand itself and its values. Through his dramatic innovations and his profound explorations of justice, fate, and human responsibility, Aeschylus demonstrated that theatre could be more than entertainment or ritual. It could be a space where a community gathered to witness its deepest concerns enacted, examined, and illuminated through the power of dramatic art. As the legacy of Aeschylus began to transform the theatrical landscape of Athens, a new voice emerged to carry the art of tragedy into unexplored territory. In the gentle hills surrounding the great city, in the year 497 BCE, a boy named Sophocles was born into a prosperous family. His father, a successful armor manufacturer, ensured his son received the finest education Athens could offer, including music, dance, and athletics. The young Sophocles would grow to become not only a celebrated playwright, but also a skilled musician and a respected citizen who served his city in various public capacities. His life would span nearly the entire 5th century BCE, allowing him to witness and contribute to Athens' golden age of culture and democracy. Sophocles first captured public attention at the age of 15, when he was chosen to lead the chorus of boys celebrating the Greek victory at the Battle of Salamis. His grace and musical ability made such an impression that the memory of that performance lingered in Athenian minds for generations. But it was in 468 BCE, when Sophocles was approximately 28 years old, that he achieved his most significant early triumph. He entered the dramatic competition at the city Dionysia and defeated the great Aeschylus himself, winning first prize. This victory marked not merely a personal achievement, but signaled the arrival of a new dramatic sensibility that would reshape Greek theatre. Where Aeschylus had introduced the second actor, fundamentally changing what was possible in theatrical storytelling, Sophocles took the bold step of adding a third actor to the stage. This innovation might seem simple, yet its implications rippled through every aspect of dramatic composition. With 3 actors present simultaneously, playwrights could now create more complex interactions, develop intricate plot structures, and explore human relationships with unprecedented depth. A scene could now contain not just dialogue, but genuine conversation among multiple parties, with one character observing and reacting, while 2 others engaged in conflict or collaboration. The possibilities for dramatic tension, irony, and revelation multiplied exponentially. Sophocles also expanded the chorus from 12 to 15 members, enriching the visual and auditory spectacle of his productions. Yet paradoxically, even as he enlarged the chorus, he gradually diminished its central role in the dramatic action. In earlier plays, the chorus had served as a primary character, driving the narrative forward. Sophocles instead transformed the chorus into a more reflective presence, commenting on events and embodying the emotional responses of ordinary citizens witnessing extraordinary circumstances. This shift allowed individual characters to occupy the foreground more completely, their personal struggles and choices becoming the true focus of the drama. The playwright's innovations extended to the visual elements of theatre as well. He introduced painted scenery, transforming the simple backdrop of earlier productions into a more detailed and evocative environment. These scenic paintings helped establish location and atmosphere, drawing audiences more completely into the world of the play. Sophocles understood that theatre engaged not merely the ear, but the eye, and that visual beauty and coherence enhanced the emotional power of the performed story. Throughout his remarkably long career, Sophocles composed more than 120 plays, though only 7 complete tragedies survive to our time. Ancient sources tell us he won first prize at the dramatic festivals approximately 24 times, and remarkably, never placed lower than second. His consistent success speaks to his mastery of the craft and his ability to move audiences year after year, maintaining artistic excellence across decades of work. Among his surviving plays, several reveal his particular genius for exploring human nature through dramatic structure. His approach to storytelling emphasized the complexity of individual choice and consequence. Unlike Aeschylus, who often focused on grand theological themes and the workings of divine justice across generations, Sophocles turned his attention more completely toward human beings themselves, their character, their decisions, and the dignity or downfall that followed from their actions. In his dramatic compositions, Sophocles demonstrated exceptional skill in constructing plots that unfolded with seemingly inevitable logic. His scenes built upon one another with careful precision, each revelation leading naturally to the next, creating a mounting sense of tension that held audiences transfixed. He possessed a remarkable talent for dramatic irony, crafting situations where the audience understood truths that characters on stage had yet to discover. This technique created a poignant tension as spectators watched characters move unknowingly toward moments of recognition that would transform their understanding of themselves and their circumstances. Character development became central to Sophocles' artistic vision. His protagonists emerged as fully realized individuals rather than symbolic figures, each possessing distinctive personalities, strengths, and flaws. He showed particular interest in characters caught between conflicting duties, facing impossible choices where any action carries profound consequences. His plays explored how people maintain integrity when circumstances seem to demand compromise, how they respond when human law conflicts with divine will or personal conscience, and how they endure when suffering seems meaningless or unjust. The playwright also demonstrated sensitivity to the experiences and perspectives of women, creating some of ancient theatre's most powerful female characters. In an era when women could neither perform in plays nor vote in the assembly, Sophocles gave voice to female experiences and perspectives, portraying women as moral agents, facing difficult choices with courage and determination. His female characters possessed intelligence, passion, and complexity, refusing to serve merely as secondary figures in male-dominated narratives. Sophocles lived through momentous decades in Athenian history, experiencing both the heights of Athenian power and the beginnings of its decline. He He witnessed the city's leadership of the Greek alliance against Persia, participated in the cultural flowering that saw the construction of the Parthenon, and lived to see Athens engage in the devastating conflict with Sparta. His plays, while set in the mythological past, resonated with contemporary concerns, exploring themes of leadership, justice, and the relationship between individual and state that spoke directly to Athenian audiences, navigating their own complex political realities. Beyond his work as a playwright, Sophocles served Athens in various public roles, including election to the Board of Generals alongside Pericles. He held religious offices and participated actively in civic life, embodying the ideal of the engaged citizen who contributed to his community through both artistic creation and public service. His life demonstrated that dedication to the arts need not require withdrawal from the world, but could instead enrich and inform one's participation in civic affairs. As Sophocles reached his final years, his artistic powers remained undimmed. Ancient biographers tell us he continued writing until nearly the end of his long life, which concluded around 406 BCE when he was approximately 90 years old. The Athenian people mourned the loss of their great poet, recognizing that an era had passed. Yet his influence would continue to shape theatrical practice for generations to come, as subsequent playwrights studied his techniques and built upon the foundations he had established. The art of theatre, which had begun with religious ritual and developed through Aeschylus into true drama, had evolved through Sophocles' innovations into an even more subtle and psychologically nuanced form of storytelling, capable of exploring the depths of human experience with remarkable sophistication and emotional power. As we settle into the gentle rhythm of ancient Athens, where the works of Sophocles had recently graced the stage with their formal elegance and balanced structure, a new voice was beginning to make itself heard in the theatre of Dionysus. This voice belonged to Euripides, a playwright who would take the traditions established by his predecessors and bend them in unexpected directions, bringing something startlingly new to the theatrical experience. Euripides was born around 480 BCE, making him younger than both Aeschylus and Sophocles, and this generational difference would manifest in his approach to drama. While he respected the foundations of Greek tragedy, he was less concerned with maintaining traditional formality and more interested in exploring the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of human beings. Where earlier tragedians had often portrayed heroes as larger than life, Euripides drew his characters with all their flaws, doubts, and very human weaknesses visible for the audience to witness. In his hands, the stage became a place where the inner lives of characters were laid bare. He was fascinated by the psychology of his dramatic figures, by what motivated their choices, and how emotion could override reason. His plays delved into the minds of those who suffered, who loved unwisely, who made terrible mistakes, and who struggled with circumstances beyond their control. This psychological depth gave his work an intimacy that audiences found both captivating and at times unsettling. Consider his treatment of female characters, which was revolutionary for his time. In an age when women had limited public roles in Athenian society, Euripides created some of the most powerful and complex female characters in all of Greek drama. His Medea stands as perhaps the most striking example. Here was a woman driven to extremes by betrayal and rage, a character whose motivations the audience could understand, even as they watched her make horrifying choices. The play doesn't simply condemn or praise her. Instead, it allows us to witness the full spectrum of her humanity. This empathetic approach extended to other marginalized figures as well. Euripides gave voice to slaves, to foreigners, to those whom Athenian society often overlooked. He seemed genuinely interested in perspectives beyond those of powerful men, and this inclusive vision expanded the emotional and thematic territory that theatre could explore. His characters spoke in language that was more natural and conversational than the elevated rhetoric favored by his predecessors, making their concerns feel immediate and relatable. Euripides was also unafraid to question traditional religious beliefs and social conventions. His plays often examined the actions of the gods with a critical eye, presenting divine beings who were capricious, vengeful, or indifferent to human suffering. This questioning spirit made some of his contemporaries uncomfortable. While Sophocles tended to affirm traditional values even as he explored human complexity, Euripides seemed more interested in examining whether those values truly served human flourishing. The theatrical innovations he introduced were sometimes subtle but significant. He made frequent use of the prologue, where a character would appear at the beginning of the play to provide background information and context. This allowed him to dive more quickly into the emotional core of his stories. He also became known for his use of the deus ex machina, where a god would appear at the end of a play, often lowered by theatrical machinery to resolve seemingly irresolvable conflicts. While later critics sometimes viewed this as a weakness, it reflected his interest in exploring how divine intervention interacted with human agency and responsibility. His correlates, while still beautiful, were often less directly connected to the action than those of Sophocles. Sometimes his choruses seemed to provide a kind of musical interlude rather than driving the dramatic argument forward. This shift suggested a gradual evolution in how the chorus functioned within Greek tragedy, pointing toward forms that would give even greater emphasis to individual characters. During his lifetime, Euripides was respected, but also controversial. He won the dramatic competitions at the Festival of Dionysus less frequently than Sophocles, claiming first prize only 5 times compared to Sophocles' many more victories. Athenian audiences seemed uncertain about his innovations, his questioning spirit, and his willingness to portray uncomfortable truths. Yet even as some found his work difficult, others were drawn to its emotional power and intellectual daring. Among his many plays, several have survived to reach us across the centuries. The Bacchae, possibly his final work, explores the arrival of Dionysus in Thebes and the violent consequences that follow when traditional order collides with ecstatic religious experience. The Trojan Women presents the aftermath of war through the eyes of the defeated, giving voice to grief and loss in ways that continue to resonate. Hippolytus examines the destructive power of desire and the tragedy that unfolds when passion and honor cannot be reconciled. In Alcestis, he explored themes of love, sacrifice, and death with a touch that moved between tragic and almost comedic elements, demonstrating his willingness to blend modes and defy easy categorization. Electra retold a familiar story, but shifted the focus to examine the psychological cost of revenge and the way violence echoes through generations. Each play revealed new facets of human experience, new questions worth asking, new ways of understanding ourselves through drama. What Euripides brought to Greek theatre was a more direct engagement with the complexities and contradictions of being human. He made space on stage for doubt, for ambiguity, for the recognition that noble ideals and messy reality don't always align. His characters feel recognizable across the vast distance of time because they struggle with emotions and dilemmas that remain part of the human condition. Though he spent most of his life in Athens, Euripides left the city in his final years, accepting an invitation to the court of King Archelaus in Macedonia. There, far from the city where he had created most of his work, he died around 406 BCE. Sophocles, who outlived his younger contemporary by only a short time, is said to have dressed his chorus in mourning to honor Euripides' passing, a gesture that speaks to the respect shared among these master craftsmen of drama. After his death, Euripides' reputation grew considerably. Later generations embraced his work with increasing enthusiasm, and his plays were performed and studied throughout the Greek-speaking world. More of his plays survived than those of any other Greek tragedian, perhaps because his human-centered approach and psychological insight continued to speak powerfully to audiences across changing times. As we rest here in the quiet of imagination, we can appreciate how Euripides expanded the possibilities of theatrical performance, bringing the focus more fully onto the individual human soul with all its light and shadow. His legacy would ripple forward through theatrical history, influencing how drama could explore the inner landscape of human experience and use the stage as a mirror for our most private struggles and profound questions. After the profound emotional depths explored by Euripides and his tragic contemporaries, ancient Athens found balance and release through laughter. The same society that gathered to witness the suffering of Medea and the torment of Prometheus also craved the sharp wit and irreverent humor of comedy. And no playwright embodied this spirit more brilliantly than Aristophanes, whose comedic genius illuminated the other half of Greek theatrical achievement. Comedy in ancient Greece followed a different calendar than tragedy. While tragic performances graced various festivals throughout the year, the great comedies found their primary home at the Lenaea, a winter festival dedicated to Dionysus, celebrated in January and February. This was a more intimate affair than the grand city Dionysia, with fewer foreign visitors present, and a predominantly Athenian audience. The setting allowed for a particular kind of boldness, a freedom to mock and satirize the very citizens who sat watching from the stone seats of the theatre. The form that Aristophanes mastered is known to us as Old Comedy, distinguishing it from the New Comedy that would emerge in later centuries. Old Comedy was unlike anything that had come before or would follow after. It combined fantastic plots with direct political commentary, blending the realistic and the absurd with remarkable fluidity. Characters might be everyday Athenian citizens in one moment, then transform into talking animals or abstract concepts in the next. The chorus, still central to these performances, might portray clouds, birds, wasps, or frogs, their elaborate costumes creating visual spectacles that delighted audiences. Aristophanes wrote more than 40 plays during his lifetime, though only 11 survive complete to our present day. Each one offers us a window into the vibrant, contentious, remarkably open society of classical Athens. His comedy was not gentle or subtle. It was loud, bawdy, filled with wordplay and puns that must have echoed through the amphitheater. The playwright took aim at politicians, generals, fellow playwrights, philosophers, and anyone else who caught his attention. He named names and spared no one from his satirical vision. In the home, there clouds. Aristophanes turned his wit upon the philosopher Socrates, portraying him as a charlatan who ran a school teaching young men to argue their way out of debts and responsibilities. The real Socrates, we might imagine, sat somewhere in that ancient audience, watching this caricature of himself suspended in a basket, claiming to walk on air and contemplate the sun. The play treated philosophical inquiry as pompous nonsense, yet it did so with such cleverness and verbal dexterity that audiences roared with appreciation. Whether this comic portrayal contributed to the later charges against Socrates remains a question that scholars ponder even now. The structure of old comedy followed certain conventions that audiences anticipated and enjoyed. The plays typically began with a prologue, introducing an absurd premise or fantastic scheme. A citizen might decide to fly up to visit the gods, or perhaps to establish a private peace treaty with Sparta, while Athens remained at war. After the prologue came the parados, the entrance of the chorus with elaborate song and dance. Then the agon, a formal debate between opposing viewpoints, allowed the playwright to explore both sides of contemporary issues with wit and intelligence. What made Aristophanic comedy particularly distinctive was the parabasis, a remarkable moment when the chorus would turn directly to the audience and address them on behalf of the playwright himself. The dramatic illusion would pause, and the actors would speak about current events, political matters, or even comment on rival playwrights and the competition for prizes. Imagine sitting in that ancient theatre and having the performance break its own fictional frame to speak directly about the world you inhabited, the very streets you walked, the politicians you knew by sight. Lysistrata remains perhaps the most famous of all Greek comedies, its central premise both audacious and timeless. Written during the long, exhausting Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the play imagines the women of Greece staging a remarkable protest to force their men to make peace. They seize the Acropolis and the treasury it holds, refusing to release funds for continued warfare. The comedy explores themes of gender, power, and the absurdity of endless conflict, all wrapped in situations that made audiences laugh, even as they recognized uncomfortable truths about their society. In The Birds, two Athenian men, weary of life in their city, convince the birds to build a new city in the sky called Cloud Cuckoo Land. This utopian fantasy becomes a staging ground for satirizing Athenian imperialism, religious practices, and the constant stream of opportunists and charlatans who arrive hoping to exploit any new venture. The play required extraordinary costumes, with actors portraying dozens of different bird species, each presumably with distinctive characteristics that the audience would recognize and appreciate. The Frogs showcases Aristophanes at perhaps his most theatrical, with the god Dionysus himself as the main character. The plot involves Dionysus descending to the underworld to bring back a great tragedian, as all the good ones have died. There, he must judge a contest between Aeschylus and Euripides weighing their respective merits as dramatic poets. The play is filled with literary criticism, parody of tragic style, and jokes that only an audience thoroughly familiar with decades of theatrical performance could fully appreciate. The famous chorus of frogs singing their breke kekex, coax coax, as Dionysus rows across the river to Hades, created a soundscape that must have enchanted the amphitheater. Comedy served democracy in ancient Athens as both safety valve and mirror. Citizens could see their leaders mocked, their sacred institutions questioned, their most cherished assumptions challenged, all within the sanctioned space of the theatre. This freedom of expression, remarkable for its time, reflected the confidence of a society that believed it could withstand scrutiny and criticism. The laughter that filled the theatre was not merely entertainment, though it certainly was that. It was also a form of civic participation, a way of thinking collectively about the community and its direction. The performance style of these comedies demanded tremendous energy and physicality from the actors. Beyond the elaborate costumes and masks, performers engaged in slapstick, acrobatics, and probably gestures that emphasized the earthier aspects of the humor. The language itself ranged from sophisticated wordplay to vulgar jokes, from lyrical poetry to crude insults. This variety kept audiences engaged across the full span of each performance. As we drift towards sleep, we might picture those ancient spectators, gathered in the winter sunshine of the Lanaya, forgetting for a few hours the pressures of war, politics, and daily survival. Through laughter, they found community. Through satire, they found truth. Through the genius of Aristophanes and his fellow comic poets, they found a theatrical tradition that balanced the tears of tragedy with the healing gift of comedy, completing the circle of human experience that drama could encompass and illuminate. As Greek theatrical traditions matured and flourished, another civilization across the Mediterranean watched with keen interest. The Romans, ever practical and adaptable, observed the dramatic performances that had captivated Greek audiences for centuries and began to reshape these traditions according to their own cultural sensibilities and tastes. The story of Roman theatre begins not with a sudden burst of creative energy, but with a gradual process of cultural borrowing and transformation. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome was expanding its influence throughout the Italian peninsula and beyond, absorbing the artistic achievements of the peoples it encountered. Greek culture held particular fascination for educated Romans, and theatrical performance proved to be among the most appealing of Greek innovations. The earliest Roman theatrical performances were imported almost directly from Greek sources. Livius Andronicus, himself a Greek slave brought to Rome, presented the first Latin translation of a Greek play in 240 BCE. This moment marked a turning point, as Roman audiences experienced for the first time the power of dramatic storytelling in their own language. The performance took place during public games, those great festivals that brought the Roman community together in celebration. Yet the Romans were not content simply to reproduce Greek drama unchanged. Their theatrical tastes differed in significant ways from their Greek predecessors. While the Greeks had viewed theatre primarily as a religious and civic ritual, the Romans approached it more as entertainment, spectacle, and social gathering. This shift in perspective would fundamentally alter the nature of theatrical performance. The playwright Plautus emerged as one of the most popular and prolific dramatists of the Roman stage. Active in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, Plautus took the framework of Greek New Comedy and infused it with distinctly Roman energy and humor. His plays bubbled with wordplay, mistaken identities, clever slaves outsmarting their masters, and farcical situations that drew roars of laughter from audiences. Works such as The Pot of Gold and The Braggart Soldier showcase his gift for creating entertaining narratives that moved at a brisk pace, filled with songs and physical comedy. Plautus understood his Roman audience well. They wanted to be entertained, to laugh, to escape from their daily concerns into worlds of comic confusion and eventual resolution. His characters were types they recognized from life, yet exaggerated for comic effect. The cunning slave, the stern father, the young man in love, the parasitic friend seeking free meals. All these figures populated his theatrical world and kept audiences returning for more. Following Plautus, the playwright Terence brought a different sensibility to Roman comedy. Writing in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Terence crafted plays with more subtle humor and greater psychological insight. His dialogue possessed an elegance and refinement that appealed to sophisticated tastes. Works like The Brothers explored family relationships and questions of proper education with a gentle touch, avoiding the broad farce that characterized some of Plautus's work. Though perhaps less popular with general audiences, Terence's plays would exert enormous influence on later European drama, particularly during the Renaissance. As Roman power and prosperity grew, so too did the physical structures dedicated to theatrical performance. Unlike the Greeks, who had carved their theaters into natural hillsides, the Romans developed engineering techniques that allowed them to construct freestanding stone theaters anywhere they chose. These architectural achievements spread throughout the empire, from Spain to Syria, each theater a testament to Roman building skill. The Roman theater building differed from its Greek ancestor in revealing ways. The orchestra, that circular space where the Greek chorus had danced and sung, shrank in Roman theaters to a semicircle, reflecting the diminished importance of choral performance. The stage itself grew deeper and more elaborate, better suited to the realistic settings and complex staging that Roman audiences preferred. Behind the stage rose the scaenae froms, an ornate architectural backdrop often 3 stories high, decorated with columns, statues, and multiple doorways through which actors could make their entrances and exits. These permanent theaters represented significant investments by the communities that built them. They stood as visible symbols of Roman civilization and cultural sophistication. When Roman influence extended into a new territory, the construction of a theater often followed, bringing with it not just entertainment, but a particular way of organizing public space and social interaction. The content of Roman theatrical performances expanded beyond the comedies of Plautus and Terence. Tragedy had its place as well, though fewer examples survive. The philosopher and statesman Seneca composed tragedies in the 1st century of the Common Era, works apparently intended for private reading rather than full-scale public performance. His plays, based on Greek myths and featuring elaborate rhetoric and violent action, would later influence Renaissance dramatists centuries after the Roman world had vanished. Roman audiences also developed a taste for more spectacular forms of entertainment that pushed beyond traditional dramatic boundaries. Pantomime performances featured a single masked dancer, interpreting mythological stories through movement, accompanied by music and a chorus. These shows attracted devoted followings and made celebrities of their star performers. Meanwhile, mime performances, less stylized than pantomime, presented comic or dramatic scenes often featuring contemporary subjects and social commentary. The relationship between performers and society in Rome differed markedly from that in Greece. While Greek actors had enjoyed considerable respect, Roman actors occupied a lower social position, their profession associated with disrepute. Yet successful performers could still achieve fame and wealth, and theatrical performances remained immensely popular across all levels of Roman society. As the Roman Empire expanded to encompass the entire Mediterranean world and beyond, theatrical culture traveled with it. Theaters rose in cities throughout the provinces, and traveling troupes brought performances to communities far from Rome itself. The Latin language of these plays helped spread Roman culture and values, even as local traditions sometimes influenced the performances themselves. This vast theatrical network represented something unprecedented in the ancient world, an interconnected cultural sphere where similar forms of entertainment and dramatic conventions extended across thousands of miles. A theatre-goer in Britain might witness a performance not entirely different from one in North Africa or the Near East, all part of a shared cultural experience that helped bind the diverse empire together. Yet even as Roman theatre reached its widest geographical extent, the seeds of change were already present. The empire would face challenges that would ultimately transform the ancient world, and in that transformation, the theatrical traditions so carefully cultivated would face an uncertain future, waiting in the shadows for a time when the human need for dramatic storytelling would call them forth once more. The grandeur of Roman theatre, with its elaborate stone structures and spectacular entertainments, did not last forever. As the Roman Empire began its slow decline in the 4th and 5th centuries, the theatrical traditions that had flourished for hundreds of years began to fade like evening shadows lengthening across an empty stage. The great theatres that had once echoed with laughter and applause gradually fell silent, their stone seats emptying as the social and political structures that supported them crumbled away. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 CE, organized theatrical performance largely disappeared from Western Europe. The reasons for this transformation were many and complex, woven together like threads in a tapestry. The economic upheaval that followed Rome's fall meant that fewer resources could be devoted to entertainment. The elaborate infrastructure required to maintain permanent theatres and professional acting companies simply could not be sustained in the chaos of the early medieval period. Cities shrank, trade networks collapsed, and the urban audiences that had sustained theatrical culture dispersed. The early Christian church, which was gaining influence throughout this period, also viewed the Roman theatre with considerable suspicion. The association of theatrical performances with pagan religious festivals and the perceived moral laxity of performers created tension between the church and theatrical traditions. Church leaders often spoke against the theatre, seeing it as a distraction from spiritual matters, and a reminder of Rome's pagan past. Yet this relationship was more nuanced than simple opposition, for the church would eventually become theatre's greatest patron in a different form. As the great stone theatres fell into disrepair, their seats became overgrown with vegetation and their stages silent. It might have seemed that the art of theatrical performance would vanish entirely from European culture. But the human impulse to perform, to tell stories through embodied action and speech, proved remarkably resilient. Theatre did not die. Instead, it transformed and survived in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the audiences who once filled the theatre of Marcellus or the grand venues of provincial Roman cities. Wandering performers became the carriers of theatrical tradition during these centuries, often called the Dark Ages. Minstrels travelled from town to town and castle to castle, offering entertainment that combined elements of storytelling, music, acrobatics, and simple dramatic sketches. These performers had no permanent theatres and no elaborate costumes or masks. They carried their art with them, adapting their performances to whatever space they found, whether a castle hall, a village square, or a country crossroads. Jongleurs, as some of these travelling entertainers were called in medieval France, maintained a connection to the performative traditions of earlier times. They juggled and tumbled, sang songs and recited poems, and enacted simple dramatic scenes. Though their art was far removed from the sophisticated tragedies of Sophocles or the complex comedies of Terence, they kept alive the fundamental practice of performance, of using the human body and voice to create entertainment and tell stories. Folk traditions and seasonal celebrations also preserved theatrical elements throughout the medieval period. Communities maintained customs involving costumes, masks, and ritualized performances connected to agricultural cycles and local festivals. These folk plays and celebrations, though not considered theatre in the formal sense, embodied the same impulse to mark important occasions through performance and dramatic representation. The mumming plays of England, performed around winter holidays, featured masked performers, enacting simple stories of death and resurrection that echoed ancient ritual patterns. In an unexpected turn, the very monasteries where Christian monks had preserved classical learning also became repositories of theatrical heritage. Scribes carefully copied the plays of Terence and other Roman dramatists, maintaining these texts even when there were no performances of them. The works of Seneca, the Roman tragic playwright, were particularly preserved, as his moralizing themes aligned more easily with Christian values. These manuscripts, illuminated and protected in monastery libraries, would become crucial sources when interesting classical drama revived centuries later. The survival of these texts is remarkable when we consider how much knowledge was lost during this period. While monks may not have fully understood or approved of the theatrical context in which these plays had originally been performed, they recognized their literary and educational value. Latin teachers used these dramatic texts to instruct students in proper Latin grammar and style, keeping the plays alive in an academic context, even as living theatrical tradition had faded. During these shadow centuries, the vocabulary and concepts of theatre remained part of educated discourse, even when actual performances were rare. The idea of theatre persisted as a cultural memory, a ghost of former glory that haunted the ruins of Roman civilization. Educated individuals might read Virgil's account of theatrical performances or encounter references to drama in the works of classical authors, maintaining an awareness of theatre as something that had once existed, even if it seemed distant from their present reality. Yet even in these quiet times, seeds of renewal were being planted. The church's liturgy itself contained inherently dramatic elements. The Mass, with its ritualized movements, responses, and symbolic actions, embodied a kind of performance. Priests wore special vestments, spoke prescribed lines, and enacted a sacred drama before their congregations. Though no one would have called it theatre, the liturgical practices of medieval Christianity contain the basic elements from which a new theatrical tradition would eventually emerge. By the 9th and 10th centuries, these liturgical practices began to incorporate more explicitly dramatic elements. Simple dialogues were added to certain feast day celebrations, with different clerics taking on different voices to enact brief scenes from scripture. These were not yet plays in any formal sense, but they represented a crucial development, a tentative step toward theatrical revival within the very institution that had once opposed the Roman stage. The preservation of performance skills through wandering entertainers, the maintenance of classical texts in monastic libraries, and the gradual incorporation of dramatic elements into religious practice all contributed to keeping the theatrical impulse alive during centuries when organized theatre had disappeared. Like a seed surviving winter beneath the snow, the art of performance endured through these shadow centuries, waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish once again. The stage was being set, slowly and almost invisibly, for theatre's rebirth in a new form, one that would emerge from the heart of medieval religious devotion and transform once again into something remarkable and enduring. As the darkness of the early medieval period began to lift, something remarkable happened within the stone walls of European churches and cathedrals. Theatre, which had seemingly vanished from the Western world, began to stir once more, awakening not in grand amphitheaters or elaborate playhouses, but in the most sacred spaces of Christian worship. The rebirth came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as priests sought new ways to help their congregations connect with the stories that formed the foundation of their faith. The earliest seeds of this theatrical revival appeared around the 9th and 10th centuries, emerging from the liturgy itself. The Mass, with its ritualized movements, responsive readings, and ceremonial elements, already contained inherently dramatic qualities. Priests and church officials recognized that these ritual actions could be expanded and elaborated to illustrate biblical narratives more vividly. What began as simple embellishments to the Easter service gradually evolved into something more theatrical, more narrative, more dramatic in nature. The quem quaeritis trope, which emerged sometime around the year 925, represents one of the earliest examples of this liturgical drama. The title comes from the Latin words meaning, "Whom do you seek?" and refers to a brief dramatic dialogue performed during Easter services. In this simple exchange, clergy members playing the role of the three Marys approaching Christ's tomb would be questioned by others, representing angels. The angels would ask, "Whom do you seek in the sepulchre?" And the Marys would respond that they sought Jesus of Nazareth. The angels would then proclaim the resurrection, singing, "He is not here, he is risen, as he said." Though lasting only a few minutes and involving minimal movement, this tiny dramatic kernel contained all the essential elements of theatre: characters, dialogue, conflict, and resolution. The performers may have worn their regular vestments, and the altar may have served as the symbolic tomb, but something theatrical had been born within the church walls. Congregations could now witness, rather than merely hear about, the most important moment in Christian theology. As the decades passed, these liturgical dramas grew more elaborate and more ambitious. The Christmas season inspired its own dramatic presentations, with scenes depicting the shepherds visiting the infant Jesus and the arrival of the three kings bearing gifts. The Ordo Stelae, or Order of the Star, dramatized the journey of the Magi, complete with a moving star to guide them. Churches began to create simple props and costumes to distinguish characters and make the stories more vivid and accessible to ordinary people, many of whom could not read Latin or understand the more complex theological teachings. The language of these early church dramas remained Latin, the language of the liturgy itself, but the visual storytelling transcended linguistic barriers. A shepherd's staff, a crown, a simple white cloth suggesting angelic garments. These visual elements communicated clearly to everyone present. The dramas helped bridge the gap between the educated clergy and the largely illiterate population, transforming abstract theological concepts into concrete, visible narratives that people could understand and remember. By the 11th and 12th centuries, these liturgical performances had expanded significantly in scope and complexity. Churches began staging dramas depicting the story of Daniel in the lion's den, the raising of Lazarus, and various saints' lives and miracles. Some productions incorporated multiple scenes, simple staging areas within the church, and increasingly elaborate costumes. The performers, still primarily clergy members or choir boys, began to develop rudimentary acting techniques to convey emotion and character. The setting within the church building influenced how these dramas were staged. Directors, if we can call them that, used different areas of the church to represent different locations in the biblical narratives. The altar might represent heaven or the Holy Sepulchre, while other areas could suggest earthly locations or even hell, sometimes represented by the church's western end, associated with darkness and sunset. This simultaneous staging, with multiple locations visible at once, would become a defining characteristic of medieval theatrical practice. As these performances grew more popular and more elaborate, they began to attract larger audiences. People came not just for regular worship, but specifically to witness these dramatic presentations during major feast days. The educational purpose remained central. These were teaching tools designed to make scripture accessible and memorable, but they also provided something else that had been absent from everyday medieval life: spectacle, entertainment, and communal experience centered around storytelling. The success of liturgical drama created an inevitable challenge. As productions grew larger and attracted more spectators, they began to strain the capacity of church interiors. The performances also sometimes required elements that seemed less appropriate for the sacred space inside the church: comic scenes, representations of devils and demons, sound effects, and increasingly elaborate staging. Additionally, the dramatic presentations occasionally disrupted the regular flow of worship services. During the 12th and 13th centuries, theatrical performances gradually began moving outside, from the interior of churches to the steps and courtyards just beyond the doors. This transition represented a pivotal moment in theatre history. While remaining connected to religious occasions and maintaining their educational purpose, these dramas were beginning their journey back into the wider community. The move outside allowed for larger audiences, more ambitious staging, and eventually, greater creative freedom. The language of performance began to shift as well. While Latin remained important for its connection to liturgy and learning, elements of vernacular languages, French, English, German, Italian, began creeping into the performances. This linguistic evolution made the dramas even more accessible to ordinary people, who could now understand every word spoken, not just the visual action unfolding before them. These outdoor performances on church grounds represented a threshold moment. Theatre was no longer confined to the interior rituals of the church, yet it remained deeply connected to religious teaching and celebration. The biblical stories that had been preserved and protected through centuries of turmoil were now being shared through live performance with entire communities. Men, women, and children who might never read scripture for themselves could now see its stories brought to life before their eyes. The stage was set, quite literally, for the next great flowering of medieval drama. The movement from church interiors to outdoor spaces opened new possibilities for scale, ambition, and community participation. Soon, entire towns would become involved in theatrical productions, with different groups taking responsibility for different episodes in vast cycles of biblical drama that would stretch across multiple days and transform the very streets and squares of medieval cities into performance spaces. As religious drama moved from the sacred spaces of churches into the bustling public squares and streets of medieval towns, a remarkable transformation took place. The simple liturgical performances that had once consisted of brief Latin dialogues within the Mass expanded into elaborate productions that could span an entire day or even several days. These grand theatrical events became known as mystery plays, taking their name not from anything secretive or puzzling, but from the medieval word mysterium, which referred to a craft or trade. The connection between crafts and these biblical dramas would prove central to their development and enduring success. The mystery play cycles represented one of the most ambitious theatrical undertakings of the medieval period. Rather than presenting isolated biblical scenes, these cycles told the complete story of Christian salvation history, beginning with the creation of the world and extending through the life of Christ to the final judgment. Imagine the scope of such an endeavor. Dozens of individual plays, or pageants as they were called, strung together to create a narrative that encompassed nothing less than the entire biblical account of human existence. In towns across England, particularly in prosperous urban centres like York, Chester, Wakefield, and Coventry, these cycle plays became deeply woven into the fabric of community life. The plays were typically performed on the Feast of Corpus Christi, a celebration that fell in late spring or early summer, when longer daylight hours and favourable weather made outdoor performance practical. The entire town participated in the preparation and presentation of these dramatic spectacles, creating a shared cultural experience that brought together people from all walks of life. The organisation of mystery plays reflected the medieval social structure in fascinating ways. The responsibility for producing individual pageants fell to the craft guilds, those associations of merchants and artisans that regulated trade and maintained standards within specific professions. Each guild would take charge of a particular biblical episode, and there was often a delightful logic to which guild performed which story. The shipwrights might present Noah's Ark, their expertise in boat building lending authenticity to the construction of the vessel. The goldsmiths, working with precious materials in their daily trade, would naturally take on the visit of the three kings bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The bakers frequently performed the Last Supper, while the pinners, who made nails, presented the crucifixion with all its somber weight. These connections between craft and content created a sense of ownership and pride among guild members. The annual performance became an opportunity to showcase not just dramatic skill, but also professional craftsmanship. Guilds competed with one another to create the most impressive presentations, investing considerable resources in costumes, props, and stage effects. The quality of a guild's pageant reflected upon the guild itself, making these performances matters of civic honor as well as religious devotion. The staging of mystery plays employed a uniquely medieval theatrical innovation, the pageant wagon. These mobile stages were essentially small platforms mounted on wheels, creating portable theaters that could be drawn through the streets from one performance location to another. The design of these wagons varied, but they typically featured an acting area with some sort of backdrop or simple scenery, and sometimes an enclosed space below that could serve as a changing area or represent hell, with actors emerging from below to represent demons or the damned. On the day of performance, the pageant wagons would process through the town, stopping at predetermined stations where audiences gathered to watch. At each station, a wagon would perform its particular episode before moving on to the next location, making room for the following wagon to present the next part of the biblical sequence. This meant that spectators could remain in one place and watch the entire cycle unfold before them as wagon after wagon arrived to present successive scenes. Alternatively, viewers might move through the town, following favorite pageants or seeking the best vantage point. The York Cycle, one of the most complete surviving examples, contained nearly 50 individual pageants. Performances began at dawn and continued until darkness fell, creating a day-long immersion in biblical narrative. The earliest pageants, depicting the creation and the fall of Lucifer, would roll out in the morning light, while the final scenes of judgment and redemption concluded as twilight approached, the fading day lending natural atmosphere to dramatizations of cosmic conclusion. The texts of these plays reveal a remarkable blend of reverence and earthiness, combining sacred subject matter with thoroughly human characterization. While biblical events provided the framework, medieval playwrights felt free to elaborate and embellish, adding dialogue, comic relief, and contemporary references that made ancient stories feel immediate and relevant. Noah's wife, for instance, frequently appears as a comic figure, stubbornly refusing to board the ark until convinced by her husband, or even engaging in physical comedy. Such additions made the plays more entertaining, while also making biblical figures seem less remote and more recognizable as people with familiar human foibles. The Wakefield cycle, associated with the town of Wakefield in Yorkshire, includes one of the most celebrated of all mystery plays, the Second Shepherd's Play. This pageant, performed by the Guild of Shepherds, expands the simple biblical account of shepherds visiting the newborn Christ into an elaborate drama that occupies itself primarily with a comic subplot involving sheep stealing. The humor and social satire of this extended scene, set in the contemporary Yorkshire countryside rather than ancient Bethlehem, eventually gives way to the appearance of the angel and the journey to the manger. But the contrast between earthly comedy and divine revelation creates a surprisingly sophisticated dramatic effect. The language of mystery plays mixed Latin phrases and hymns with vernacular English, making them accessible to ordinary townspeople while retaining elements of liturgical tradition. Actors were amateur performers, guild members, and townspeople who rehearsed their roles and took their performances seriously, even without professional training. The plays provided entertainment, certainly, but they also served educational and devotional purposes, bringing biblical stories to life for populations that were largely illiterate and had no access to scripture except through church services and such dramatic presentations. As decades and then centuries passed, these cycles became beloved traditions, repeated annually with modifications and improvements. Scripts were copied and preserved, though much has been lost to time. The mystery plays we know today survive in manuscript collections that represent only a fraction of what once existed across medieval Europe. Yet even these fragments reveal the vitality and creativity of medieval theatrical culture, demonstrating how communities transformed religious devotion into theatrical spectacle, creating drama that was at once sacred and profoundly human, entertaining and instructive, traditional and constantly renewed through each year's performance. In the great pageant wagons rolling through medieval streets, in the voices of bakers and carpenters and goldsmiths bringing ancient stories to life, we witness theatre serving its timeless function, gathering communities together, making distant events feel present and real, and finding in performance a way to explore and express the deepest human questions about existence, morality, and meaning. As the great biblical cycles reached their height in medieval towns and villages, another form of theatrical expression emerged alongside them, one that spoke not of historical events from scripture, but of the eternal struggle within every human soul. These were the morality plays, dramatic allegories that transformed abstract spiritual concepts into living, breathing characters who walked and spoke upon the stage. Imagine a marketplace or town square in the 15th century where a platform has been erected and townspeople gather as afternoon light begins to soften. The performance they are about to witness will feature no prophets or apostles, no recreation of events from sacred history. Instead, they will see themselves reflected in a single character who represents all humanity, confronted by personified forces of virtue and vice competing for possession of the immortal soul. The morality play developed from a desire to make spiritual instruction more immediate and personal, while mystery plays depicted the grand sweep of biblical narrative. Morality plays focused on the individual's journey through life and the choices that determined eternal destiny. These performances were not about distant biblical figures, but about every man and every woman, about the audience members themselves and the daily decisions they faced. The structure of these plays followed a recognizable pattern that audiences came to anticipate with both comfort and concern. A protagonist representing humanity would encounter various allegorical characters embodying virtues such as good deeds, knowledge, and discretion, as well as vices like pride, avarice, and gluttony. Through dialogue and dramatic action, these abstract qualities became tangible. Their conflicts played out in ways that even the humblest spectator could understand. The most famous of all morality plays, known simply as Everyman, exemplifies the power and directness of this theatrical form. In this drama, the protagonist receives a summons from death and must prepare for a final reckoning. Everyman desperately seeks companions to accompany him on this ultimate journey, approaching fellowship, kindred, and goods in turn. Each promises support, but ultimately abandons him when they learn the true nature of his destination. Only good deeds, though weakened by Everyman's neglect, remains faithful and accompanies him to face divine judgment. The emotional impact of Everyman derived from its universal resonance. Every person watching knew they too would one day receive death's summons, that earthly attachments would prove fleeting, and that only the quality of one's actions would endure. The play's starkness, its stripping away of all worldly comfort, created a powerful meditation on mortality and meaning that transcended its didactic purpose to achieve genuine dramatic force. Other morality plays explored the theme of spiritual struggle from different angles. The Castle of Perseverance, one of the earliest and most elaborate examples, depicted mankind's entire life journey from birth to death. In this ambitious production, a castle representing refuge in virtue stood at the center of the playing area, while scaffolds positioned around the perimeter housed various vices who tempted mankind toward destruction. The physical staging itself became a map of the soul's geography, with the castle as a sanctuary and the surrounding spaces as domains of temptation. The characters in morality plays bore names that announce their nature with transparent clarity. Mercy offered forgiveness, reason counseled wisdom, and worldly affection represented earthly attachments. On the opposing side, characters like Mischief, Nowadays, and New Guys embodied contemporary forms of corruption and moral decay. This naming convention meant audiences immediately understood each character's role in the spiritual drama unfolding before them. The theatrical techniques employed in morality plays combined elements from earlier medieval drama with innovations suited to their allegorical purpose. Costumes helped distinguish virtues from vices, often through color symbolism and visual emblems. Vices might dress in garish, exaggerated fashion, speaking in crude language and engaging in slapstick comedy that entertained even as it instructed. Virtues typically appeared in more dignified attire, their speech elevated, and their bearing serene. This contrast made the moral distinctions visible and memorable. The language of morality plays ranged from solemn poetry to colloquial humor. Serious moments of spiritual crisis employed formal verse that elevated the action to cosmic significance, while comic scenes featuring vices used contemporary slang and topical references that grounded the plays in the audience's everyday experience. This mixing of registers kept performances engaging while serving the instructional purpose that justified their existence. Performance spaces for morality plays varied according to circumstances and ambition. Some were staged in town squares or marketplaces using simple platform stages. Others employed more elaborate arrangements with multiple acting areas representing different spiritual realms. The Castle of Perseverance required a circular performance space with specific scaffolds positioned according to detailed diagrams that survive in the play's manuscript. These staging requirements suggest a sophisticated understanding of theatrical space and its symbolic potential. The performers in Morality plays might include both amateur townspeople and more experienced traveling players. The tradition of professional entertainment had never entirely disappeared, and by the 15th century, small troupes of actors moved from town to town, offering their services for various occasions. Morality plays, with their relatively small casts and portable staging requirements, proved ideal vehicles for these traveling companies, who could perform in various venues and adapt to different circumstances. The didactic purpose of Morality plays never entirely overwhelmed their theatrical vitality. Playwrights understood that instruction required engagement, that audiences would absorb moral lessons more effectively if they were entertained and emotionally invested in the drama. The best Morality plays achieved a balance between teaching and storytelling, creating characters that transcended their allegorical functions to become genuinely interesting figures whose struggles held dramatic interest beyond their symbolic meanings. As the 15th century progressed into the 16th, Morality plays began to evolve and diversify. Some incorporated more complex psychological exploration, while others grew more satirical, using the allegorical framework to comment on contemporary social and political issues. The clear boundaries between virtues and vices became more ambiguous, reflecting perhaps a more complicated understanding of human nature and moral choice. The influence of Morality plays extended far beyond their period of greatest popularity. The concept of using abstract qualities as characters would reappear in later theatrical traditions, from Renaissance masks to modern expressionist drama. The focus on individual moral choice and consequence helped establish patterns of characterization and conflict that would shape theatrical storytelling for centuries to come. As we rest here, considering these allegorical dramas that once captivated medieval audiences, we can appreciate how theatre served not merely as entertainment, but as a space for contemplation and self-examination. The Morality play invited each spectator to see themselves in the protagonist's journey, to recognize their own struggles with temptation and virtue, their own confrontation with mortality and meaning. In this way, theatre became a mirror held up to the soul, reflecting eternal questions in temporary, earthly form. As the medieval Morality plays continued, their allegorical lessons across town squares and church grounds, something remarkable was stirring in the warm lands of Italy. The years of the 14th and 15th centuries brought a renewed fascination with the classical past, as scholars and artists rediscovered the texts and ideas of ancient Greece and Rome. This cultural flowering, which we know as the Renaissance, touched every aspect of creative life, and theatre was no exception to this transformative spirit. In the libraries of monasteries and the private collections of wealthy patrons, dusty manuscripts began to reveal their secrets. The plays of Plautus and Terence, carefully preserved through centuries of relative obscurity, were read with fresh eyes and growing excitement. The architectural writings of Vitruvius described the theatres of antiquity, inspiring Italian architects to imagine how such spaces might be recreated. This wasn't merely an academic exercise. These rediscovered works sparked a genuine desire to bring theatre back to life in forms that would honor the classical tradition while speaking to contemporary audiences. The Italian courts became centers of theatrical experimentation. In Ferrara, Mantua, and Florence, wealthy families commissioned performances of classical plays, often staging them in palace courtyards or specially constructed temporary theatres. These productions were lavish affairs, featuring painted scenery, elaborate costumes, and stage machinery that could create spectacular effects. The perspective paintings that decorated the stages created illusions of depth, showing city streets or palace halls receding into the distance. A visual innovation that left audiences marveling at the artistry before them. From this renewed engagement with classical theatre emerged something entirely new, something that would prove remarkably influential and enduring. In the squares and marketplaces of Italian cities, particularly in Venice and throughout the regions of northern Italy, professional troupes began performing a distinctive form of improvised comedy known as Commedia dell'arte. The name itself means comedy of the professional artists, distinguishing these trained performers from the amateur enthusiasts who might stage occasional theatrical entertainments. The Commedia dell'arte represented a fascinating blend of old and new. Like the ancient Roman comedies, these performances featured recognizable character types and often centered on themes of love, deception, and social misunderstanding. Yet the approach was entirely fresh and spontaneous. Rather than memorizing scripted dialogue, the actors worked from scenarios, basic plot outlines that provided the framework for improvisation. The performers, skilled in physical comedy, music, and theatrical technique, would flesh out these scenarios with dialogue, comic business, and acrobatic feats, creating performances that were never quite the same twice. The characters of Commedia dell'arte became beloved figures, each with distinctive costumes, masks, and personalities that audiences recognized instantly. There was Arlecchino, or Harlequin, the clever servant with his distinctive diamond-patterned costume, always hungry and usually scheming to get a good meal or help his master in matters of love. Pantalone appeared as the wealthy but miserly Venetian merchant, often an old man pursuing young women or guarding his money with absurd vigilance. Il Dottore, the pompous doctor or lawyer from Bologna, spoke in endless, nonsensical Latin quotations and pretentious pseudo-intellectual discourse. The character of Brighella brought cunning and sometimes sinister schemes to the stage, while Colombina served as the clever maidservant, often more intelligent than her mistress or the men around her. The Capitano strutted about as a braggart soldier, claiming impossible military victories, while proving himself a coward when faced with actual danger. The young lovers, known as the innamorati, appeared without masks, their handsome faces visible as they spoke in elevated language about their passionate devotion, often providing a romantic center to balance the comedy of the masked characters around them. These troupes traveled extensively, carrying their art across Italy and eventually throughout Europe. They performed on temporary stages, set up in town squares, in the courtyards of inns, and sometimes in the palaces of nobility who invited them for special occasions. Their portable nature meant they needed little in the way of scenery or elaborate theatrical machinery. A few props, their costumes and masks, and the considerable talents of the performers themselves were sufficient to create an evening's entertainment. The physical skill required for Commedia dell'arte was extraordinary. Performers trained in acrobatics, dance, and stage combat. They needed to master the art of the lazzi, those comic routines and pieces of physical business that could be inserted into any scenario. A lazzi might involve an elaborate pantomime of swatting a fly, a comic fight sequence, or a virtuoso display of physical confusion and pratfalls. The best performers developed reputations for particular lazzi, signature routines that audiences would anticipate with delight. Women performed alongside men in Commedia dell'arte troupe, a significant departure from many theatrical traditions of the time. These actresses, known as attrici, played the female roles and often achieved considerable fame for their talents. Some became celebrated throughout Europe, their names known far beyond the Italian cities where they began their careers. The presence of women on stage brought a different energy to the performances and allowed for romantic scenes that had a naturalness impossible when boys or men played female roles. The influence of Commedia dell'arte spread far beyond Italy's borders. French audiences embraced the Italian troupes who visited Paris, and elements of the form influenced French theatrical development for generations. In England, the character types and comic situations found their way into various forms of entertainment. The spirit of improvisation, the use of stock characters, and the emphasis on physical comedy left traces in theatrical traditions across the continent. Meanwhile, in the Italian cities themselves, theatre was evolving in other directions as well. Architects designed permanent indoor theatres, applying Renaissance principles of harmony and proportion to create beautiful spaces for performance. The Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza, completed in the 1580s, recreated the theatre of classical antiquity as Renaissance scholars imagined it, with rising semicircular seating and an elaborate permanent stage set showing streets receding in perfect perspective. These new theatres provided settings for both classical revivals and contemporary plays written by Italian dramatists who sought to create works worthy of these magnificent spaces. As the 16th century progressed, Italian theatre had firmly established itself as a vital art form, combining reverence for classical tradition with innovative new approaches to performance. The seeds planted during this period of cultural rebirth would continue to grow and flourish, influencing theatrical development across Europe in the centuries to come. The traveling Commedia troupes carried Italian theatrical innovation to distant lands, while the beautiful new theatres stood as monuments to the enduring power of dramatic art to move, delight, and bring communities together in shared experience. As the Renaissance spread northward from Italy, bringing with it a renewed appreciation for classical learning and artistic expression, the island nation of England was preparing for its own remarkable theatrical awakening. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I, beginning in 1558, would usher in an era of dramatic flourishing that remains unmatched in its creative energy and cultural impact. This was a time when theatre moved from the margins of society to its very centre, becoming a vital force in the daily life of London, and marking a transformation in how people experienced storytelling. The England that welcomed this theatrical revolution was a nation finding its confidence on the world stage. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had secured the country's independence and bolstered national pride. Trade was expanding, the population of London was growing rapidly, and a new prosperity was creating audiences hungry for entertainment. Into this fertile ground, professional theatre took root and flourished with extraordinary vigour. Before the great playhouses rose along the Thames, theatrical performances in England had been scattered affairs. Players travelled from town to town, performing in inn-yards, great halls, and wherever they could gather an audience. These companies often enjoyed the patronage of noble lords, whose names they bore for protection and legitimacy. But the growing demand for theatrical entertainment in London created an opportunity for something more permanent, more ambitious, and more accessible to ordinary people. The first purpose-built playhouse in London, simply called the Theatre, was constructed in 1576 by James Burbage, a carpenter turned actor and entrepreneur. He chose a location in Shoreditch, just outside the city walls, where the restrictive regulations of London's authorities held less sway. This positioning was strategic, as city officials often viewed theatre with suspicion, concerned about crowds, disorder, and what they perceived as moral hazards. Yet beyond the city's jurisdiction, theatre could thrive. The design that Burbage pioneered would become the template for the great playhouses of the era. These structures were typically polygonal in shape, with open centres exposed to the sky. Galleries ringed the interior on multiple levels, providing covered seating for those who could afford the higher admission prices. The stage itself projected out into the central yard, where the groundlings stood for the price of a single penny, packed closely together and exposed to whatever weather the English skies provided. The Globe Theatre, which would become the most famous playhouse of the age, was built in 1599 in Southwark, on the southern bank of the Thames. Its construction involved a dramatic story of its own. When the lease expired on the land where the theatre stood, the company dismantled the building timber by timber and transported it across the frozen Thames, reconstructing it in its new location. This practical act of recycling resulted in the theatre that would host some of the greatest dramatic works ever written. Standing in the yard of the Globe on a performance afternoon, you would have found yourself surrounded by a cross-section of London society, apprentices and merchants, sailors and servants, gentlewomen and working people all mingled together. The penny admission for groundlings made theatre accessible even to those of modest means, while the galleries accommodated those seeking more comfort and social distinction. This mixing of social classes in a shared entertainment was relatively unusual for the period and gave theatre a unique democratic quality. The playhouses operated during daylight hours, as performances depended entirely on natural light. Afternoon shows typically began around 2 o'clock, announced by flags flying above the theatre, and sometimes by trumpet calls that echoed across the river. The atmosphere before a performance must have been electric with anticipation, as audiences gathered from across the city, ferried across the Thames by wherrymen, who did brisk business transporting theatregoers. The audience experience in these playhouses was far more interactive and participatory than what we might expect in modern theatres. Spectators ate and drank during performances. Vendors circulated selling refreshments, and the crowd felt free to express their reactions loudly and immediately. Approval brought cheers and applause, while displeasure might be met with hissing, heckling, or even thrown food. Actors had to be prepared to engage with this responsive audience, sometimes improvising responses to comments from the crowd or adjusting their performances to maintain attention. The theatres themselves became landmarks in London's landscape, competing establishments that fostered rivalry and innovation. Beyond the Globe, there was the Rose, the Swan, the Fortune, and others, each with its own character and repertoire. Companies of actors were attached to these venues, working as cooperative ventures where leading members held shares in both the company and the playhouse. This business model created stability and encouraged investment in quality productions. The physical structure of these theatres influenced the nature of the drama performed within them. The thrust stage, extending into the audience on three sides, created an intimate relationship between actors and spectators. The pillars supporting the roof over the stage could be incorporated into action, used as hiding places, or standing for trees. A trapdoor in the stage floor allowed for dramatic entrances and exits from below, while the roof above, painted with stars and called the heavens, could open to lower actors or props on ropes and pulleys. Behind the main stage area, a curtained discovery space allowed for revealing scenes already arranged, while doors on either side of the stage provided formal entrances and exits. Above, a gallery served multiple purposes, providing space for musicians, for characters appearing at windows or on walls, and sometimes for wealthy patrons who wished to be seen watching the play. These architectural features were all resources that playwrights incorporated into their dramatic designs. The commercial nature of these theatres drove a constant demand for new material. Companies performed a different play almost every day, maintaining a rotating repertoire that required actors to hold numerous roles in their memories simultaneously. This meant playwrights needed to produce new works regularly to keep audiences returning. The competition between theatres and companies created an environment where innovation was valued and successful formulas were quickly imitated and adapted. Theatre had become a business, but it was also becoming an art form of remarkable sophistication. The playhouses of Elizabethan London were not merely entertainment venues, but crucibles of dramatic development, where writers, actors, and audiences together forged a new cultural institution. The wooden O of the Globe and its companion theatres transformed the theatrical landscape of Europe, proving that drama could be both popular and profound, commercially viable and artistically ambitious. On those stages thrust out into crowds of eager Londoners, something remarkable was taking shape, a synthesis of classical tradition, medieval heritage, and contemporary innovation that would produce works of enduring power and beauty. As the playhouses of London thrived, and audiences filled the wooden galleries day after day, one figure emerged whose mastery of dramatic art would become so profound that his name would become synonymous with theatrical excellence itself. William Shakespeare arrived in London sometime in the late 1580s, a young man from the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, carrying with him an education in classical literature and an extraordinary sensitivity to the rhythms of human speech. In the bustling theatrical world of Elizabethan London, Shakespeare began his career as an actor and quickly became involved in writing plays for his company. What set him apart from his contemporaries was not a single innovation, but rather his remarkable ability to synthesize everything that theatre had learned over centuries into works of unprecedented depth and beauty. He absorbed the classical structures of Greek and Roman drama the moral complexity of medieval plays, and the vibrant energy of Renaissance theatre, then transformed these influences into something entirely his own. Shakespeare's approach to language revolutionized what dramatic dialogue could achieve. Where earlier English playwrights had often written in rhyming couplets or prose, Shakespeare mastered blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter that flowed with the natural cadences of English speech while maintaining a musical quality. This form gave his characters the ability to express complex thoughts and emotions with both elegance and apparent spontaneity. A courtier could deliver formal speeches in elevated verse, while a gravedigger might speak in prose, and the very rhythm of their words revealed something essential about who they were. His innovations in character development marked perhaps his greatest contribution to theatrical art. While earlier plays often featured characters who represented particular types or virtues, Shakespeare created individuals who seemed to possess the full complexity of real human beings. Hamlet became not merely a revenge hero, but a thinking, doubting, philosophical mind grappling with questions of existence and morality. Lady Macbeth transcended the role of ambitious villain to become a portrait of conscience and psychological disintegration. Falstaff emerged as simultaneously comic and tragic, charming and reprehensible, vital and decaying. Shakespeare understood that the most compelling drama arose from internal conflict as much as external action. His tragic heroes typically possess both greatness and fatal flaws, and we watch them make choices that lead inevitably toward their downfall. Othello's jealousy, Lear's pride, Macbeth's ambition, these internal weaknesses drive the action forward with a sense of tragic inevitability. Yet Shakespeare never made his characters simple or one-dimensional. Even his villains possess moments of humanity that complicate our responses to them. The breadth of his dramatic output remains astonishing. He wrote tragedies that plumbed the depths of human suffering and moral complexity, comedies that celebrated love and community, while exploring themes of identity and transformation, and history plays that examined power, kingship, and the destiny of nations. Each genre received from him works of lasting brilliance. His comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream and As You Like It wove together multiple plot lines with extraordinary dexterity, moving characters through enchanted forests and pastoral landscapes where the normal rules of society temporarily dissolved, allowing for transformation and renewal. His tragedies built upon the Greek tradition of showing the fall of great individuals, but he added psychological dimensions that made his protagonists feel startlingly modern. When Macbeth contemplates murder, we hear his tortured reasoning in soliloquies that reveal the workings of a mind at war with itself. When Romeo and Juliet meet at a ball, their dialogue forms a shared sonnet, the very structure of their speech enacting the instant connection between them. Shakespeare also demonstrated remarkable skill in dramatic structure, often weaving together multiple plot lines that illuminate each other through parallel or contrast. In King Lear, the main plot of Lear and his daughters runs alongside the subplot of Gloucester and his sons, each story deepening the themes of the other. The comic scenes in his tragedies often provide not mere relief, but commentary on the serious action, as when the porter in Macbeth jokes about hell immediately after Duncan's murder, his words resonating with dark irony. His plays reflected the world of his time while speaking to universal human experiences. He set stories in Italy, Denmark, ancient Rome, and magical islands. Yet all these diverse settings became stages for exploring questions that concerned Elizabethan audiences and continue to resonate today. What do we owe to family versus country? How do we navigate love across social divides? What happens when ambition corrupts? How do we face mortality? The theatrical environment of his era shaped his writing in practical ways. Because performances occurred in daylight, Shakespeare used language to establish time and atmosphere. Characters described the approach of dawn or the darkness of night, creating these settings through words rather than lighting. The thrust stage, extending into the audience, allowed for intimate soliloquies, where characters could share their private thoughts directly with spectators, creating a powerful sense of connection and complicity. Shakespeare wrote his plays to be performed by a specific company of actors, the Lord Chamberlain's men, later known as the King's men. This stability allowed him to craft roles with particular performers in mind, knowing their strengths and capabilities. The comic actor Will Kemp influenced his creation of characters like Dogberry, while the versatile Richard Burbage brought to life tragic heroes from Hamlet to Othello. The requirement that young boys play female roles shaped how he wrote for women, often giving his heroines disguises as young men that allowed the boy actors to perform in more comfortable territory while creating rich dramatic possibilities. Throughout his career, Shakespeare continued to evolve and experiment. His early works showed a young playwright learning his craft, sometimes following conventions closely. His middle period brought forth his greatest tragedies and most sophisticated comedies, works of tremendous complexity and power. His late plays, sometimes called romances, moved towards stories of loss and redemption, featuring magic, music, and reconciliation. The Tempest, likely his final solo-authored play, seems almost a meditation on the power of art itself, with the magician Prospero controlling events on his island before ultimately choosing to abandon his magical powers. The influence of his work extended far beyond his own lifetime. His plays remained in performance, adapted and interpreted by each new generation. His language entered everyday speech, contributing countless phrases and expressions to English. His approach to character and dramatic structure became foundational to Western theatre. Yet the man himself remains somewhat mysterious, known to us primarily through his works and a handful of historical records. Perhaps this absence of definitive biography has helped his plays endure, allowing each age to find in them what speaks most powerfully to contemporary concerns. In the gentle darkness of sleep's approach, we might picture that wooden theatre by the Thames, where an actor steps forward to speak words written more than 4 centuries ago, words that still possess the power to move audiences to laughter and tears, to recognition and wonder. Shakespeare's achievement was to capture in dramatic form the full range of human experience, creating a body of work that continues to illuminate the eternal mysteries of what it means to be human. Having explored Shakespeare's magnificent contributions to dramatic literature, we now turn our attention to the practical magic that brought his words to life, the stagecraft and theatrical techniques that transformed written scripts into living, breathing performances in the playhouses of late Renaissance England. Picture, if you will, an afternoon at the Globe Theatre in the early 1600s. The performance begins at 2 o'clock. Time to take advantage of natural daylight streaming through the open roof. There are no electric lights to illuminate the stage, no switches to control the mood. Instead, the actors and their words must work with the sun itself, their performances adapting to the changing quality of light as afternoon progresses toward evening. This fundamental constraint shaped every aspect of how theatre companies worked, demanding creativity and ingenuity at every turn. The stage itself was a remarkable piece of architectural design, a large platform that thrust out into the audience, surrounded on 3 sides by standing spectators in the pit. Unlike our modern theatres, where audiences sit in darkness, facing a brightly lit stage framed by a proscenium arch, the Shakespearean stage created an intimate relationship between performer and viewer. Actors could move to the very edge of the platform, speaking directly to groundlings who stood mere feet away. This proximity meant every gesture, every facial expression carried weight and meaning. Behind the main platform rose the tiring house, a multi-story structure that served as both backstage area and architectural backdrop. Its facade featured doors through which actors made their entrances and exits, while an upper gallery provided space for balcony scenes. Think of Romeo calling up to Juliet, or a castle rampart where sentries might keep watch. Some theatres also featured a small inner stage that could be revealed by drawing back a curtain, useful for discovering a scene already in progress, or revealing a dramatic tableau. The mechanics of stagecraft in this era required remarkable coordination and timing. Trapdoors built into the stage floor allowed for supernatural appearances and disappearances. A ghost could rise from below, emerging from what actors called the hell beneath the stage. Meanwhile, above the platform stretched a painted ceiling known as the heavens, decorated with stars and celestial imagery. From this canopy, actors or props could be lowered using rope and pulley systems, creating the illusion of divine intervention or magical flight. Sound effects added another layer of theatrical illusion. Thunder could be produced by rolling cannonballs down wooden troughs or shaking large metal sheets. The crack of lightning might be suggested through the clash of swords backstage. Trumpets and drums announced royal entrances and military scenes, while softer music from recorders, lutes, and viols accompanied romantic moments or supernatural appearances. Musicians occupied the gallery above the stage, sometimes visible to the audience, sometimes hidden, their melodies weaving through the spoken dialogue. Costumes formed perhaps the most visible and expensive element of theatrical production. Acting companies invested heavily in elaborate garments, understanding that visual spectacle attracted audiences. Contemporary accounts reveal that companies sometimes spent more on a single cloak or doublet than they paid a playwright for an entire script. Actors wore clothing that broadly suggested their characters' social status. Kings in rich velvets and ermines, servants in simpler woolens, soldiers in military dress. Historical accuracy mattered less than theatrical impact. Roman senators might wear Elizabethan doublets, and ancient British kings might sport Renaissance court fashions. Quick changes presented perpetual challenges, with plays often featuring numerous characters and actors playing multiple roles. Costume changes had to happen rapidly in the tiring house. Companies developed efficient systems, with assistants helping actors switch garments between scenes. The structure of plays themselves accommodated these practical necessities. Shakespeare often wrote scenes that allowed time for major characters to change costumes offstage, while minor characters held the audience's attention. Properties, or props, range from simple handheld objects to elaborate set pieces. Swords, daggers, letters, and crowns were standard items, carefully tracked and maintained by company members. Larger properties might include thrones, beds, or trees that could be carried on and off stage as scenes required. Without elaborate scenery, these few key objects helped establish location and atmosphere, their presence signaling to audiences where the action unfolded. The collaborative nature of theatre companies shaped every production. In Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, later renamed the King's Men, members shared both labour and profit. Leading actors like Richard Burbage brought star power and interpretive genius to major roles. Shakespeare himself likely performed in his own plays, tradition suggesting he played dignified supporting roles like old King Hamlet's ghost. Apprentices and hired men filled smaller parts, while boys trained to play female characters. These boy actors deserve particular attention, for they carried immense responsibility. English law and custom prohibited women from performing on public stages, so young male actors portrayed all female roles, from comic serving maids to tragic heroines like Juliet, Ophelia, and Lady Macbeth. Boys apprenticed to established actors, learning movement, voice, and the subtle art of suggesting femininity through gesture and bearing rather than crude imitation. The best achieved remarkable skill, convincing audiences to see past their actual gender to the characters they embodied. The absence of elaborate scenery meant that language itself painted pictures of place and time. When Shakespeare wrote, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks," he used Juliet's speech to establish nighttime in an orchard. Description embedded in dialogue told audiences whether they witnessed a castle, a forest, or a city street. This theatrical convention freed plays from realistic representation, allowing locations to shift rapidly. One scene might unfold in Rome, the next in Egypt, requiring only that actors walk off one side of the stage and enter from another. Rehearsal practices differed markedly from modern methods. Companies performed a different play each afternoon, cycling through their repertoire, which meant rehearsal time was precious and limited. Actors received only their own lines and cues, called sides, rather than complete scripts. They learned their parts individually, then came together for brief group rehearsals to coordinate entrances, exits, and major stage business. This system demanded quick studies and skilled improvisers who could adapt if something went awry during performance. The theatrical day involved careful orchestration of many moving parts. Company members arrived hours before performance to prepare costumes, check properties, and run through complicated sequences. A prompter stood ready backstage with the complete manuscript, prepared to feed forgotten lines. Property masters ensured every sword, letter, and crown waited in its proper place. Musicians tuned instruments and reviewed their cues. Then, as the flag rose above the theatre, signaling a performance that day, audiences began to gather, and the magic of transformation began anew. As we prepare to journey next into the theatrical wonders of Spain's Golden Age, rest now with images of that English stage floating in your mind, the thrust platform alive with movement, the galleries above filled with music, and voices speaking poetry that still resonates across the centuries. As we leave behind the bustling world of Shakespearean England, our journey through theatrical history carries us southward across the Channel and over the Pyrenees to the sun-drenched plazas and vibrant chorales of Spain. Here, during the same period when the Globe Theatre stood proudly on the banks of the Thames, another theatrical renaissance was unfolding, one that would produce an extraordinary volume of dramatic works and establish traditions that remain distinctly Spanish to this day. The late 16th and early 17th centuries marked Spain's Siglo de Oro, its golden age, a time when the nation stood at the height of its political and cultural influence. Spanish ships sailed the world's oceans, bringing wealth and new ideas back to the Iberian Peninsula. In this atmosphere of prosperity and confidence, theatre flourished with remarkable intensity. The appetite for new plays seemed insatiable, and playwrights worked at a pace that seems almost impossible to modern minds, crafting hundreds of works to satisfy audiences hungry for drama, romance, and spectacle. At the heart of this theatrical explosion stood Lope Felix de Vega Carpio, known simply as Lope de Vega, a man whose productivity astounds even across the centuries. By his own account, Lope wrote more than 1,500 plays during his lifetime, though only several hundred survive today. This prolific output meant that he often completed full 3-act plays in a matter of days, maintaining a creative energy that seemed boundless. His works ranged across every imaginable theme, from historical dramas to cape and sword adventures, from pastoral comedies to religious allegories. Lope possessed an intuitive understanding of what audiences wanted to see. He crafted plays that moved swiftly, that mixed comic and serious elements freely, and that celebrated Spanish values of honor, faith, and passionate love. His characters spoke in elegant verse that nonetheless captured the rhythms of natural speech, making even complex emotions accessible to listeners from all walks of life. In his theoretical work, The New Art of Writing Plays, Lope defended his approach against critics who insisted on strict classical rules, arguing instead for a more flexible, audience-centered drama that reflected the tastes and sensibilities of contemporary Spain. The physical spaces where these plays came to life differed notably from their English counterparts. The corrales, or courtyard theatres, began as precisely what their name suggests: enclosed courtyards nestled between buildings in the crowded urban centres of Madrid, Seville, and other Spanish cities. These rectangular spaces featured a raised stage at one end, with the ground level open to the sky, creating a standing area for those who paid the lowest admission prices. Wooden balconies and galleries ran along the sides of the courtyard, providing seating for those who could afford it, while the windows of surrounding buildings might also be rented for viewing. At the back of the courtyard, opposite the stage, sat the cazuela, a gallery reserved exclusively for women. Spanish society maintained certain proprieties even in the democratic space of the theatre, and this separation was considered essential for moral respectability. The arrangement created its own dynamic, as actors played to different sections of the audience, aware of the varying responses from the standing groundlings, the seated merchants and craftsmen in the side galleries, and the women watching from their designated space. The chorales operated under the management of charitable brotherhoods, religious organizations that used the profits from theatrical performances to support hospitals and care for the poor. This arrangement provided a measure of moral legitimacy to an entertainment that still drew suspicion from more conservative elements of society. Performances typically took place in the afternoon, taking advantage of natural daylight, and the theatres buzzed with an energy that combined spectacle, social gathering, and cultural event. Into this vibrant theatrical world came Pedro Calderón de la Barca, a playwright whose works represented the flowering of Spanish dramatic art. Calderón brought a more philosophical and poetic sensibility to the stage, crafting plays that explored profound questions of free will, destiny, honor, and reality itself. His most famous work, Life is a Dream, presents the story of Prince Segismundo, imprisoned from birth because of a prophecy, who must grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of existence and human agency. Calderón excelled at writing autos sacramentales, elaborate one-act allegorical plays performed on the feast of Corpus Christi. These religious dramas combined theological complexity with spectacular staging, featuring ornate mobile stages that processed through city streets. The autos represented a uniquely Spanish theatrical form, blending the didactic purposes of medieval mystery plays with the sophisticated verse and stagecraft of the Golden Age. The themes that dominated Spanish Golden Age theatre reflected the values and tensions of the society that produced them. Honor occupied a central position in countless plays, with characters navigating the intricate codes that governed reputation and social standing. The pundona, or point of honor, could drive entire plots, as characters struggled to defend or restore their good name. Love, too, featured prominently, though often entangled with questions of duty, social class, and family obligation. Spanish playwrights also developed a distinctive theatrical structure. Unlike the five-act format common elsewhere in Europe, Spanish plays typically consisted of 3 acts, called jornadas. This structure allowed for a particular rhythm, with the first act establishing characters and situation, the second developing complications, and the third providing resolution. Within this framework, playwrights mixed verse forms freely, shifting between romance meter, redondilas, decimas, and other patterns to suit different dramatic moments and emotional tones. The gracioso, a comic servant character, became a standard figure in Spanish theatre, providing humor and often serving as an earthier counterpoint to his noble master. This character type allowed playwrights to comment ironically on the high-minded concerns of the aristocratic characters, while also exploring themes from a different social perspective. The gracioso might be cowardly, where his master was brave, practical, where his master was idealistic, yet also demonstrated loyalty and a rough wisdom of his own. As evening settles over our exploration of Spanish Golden Age theatre, we can imagine the energy of those courtyard performances, the afternoon sun slanting across the stage as actors in elaborate costumes declaimed their verses, their voices rising above the sounds of the city beyond the corral walls. The theatrical culture of Spain during this period produced not only an extraordinary body of dramatic literature, but also a tradition of performance that celebrated language, emotion, and spectacle in equal measure. Tomorrow, as our story continues, we will journey northward to France, where a different set of principles would guide theatrical creation, and where new masters would refine the art of drama according to very particular rules. As we journey northward from the sun-drenched courtyards of Spain, we find ourselves in the elegant salons and candlelit theatres of 17th century France, where theatrical art took on an entirely different character. Here, in the court of Louis XIV and the sophisticated streets of Paris, drama became subject to rules and refinement, guided by principles drawn from classical antiquity and filtered through a distinctly French sensibility. The French theatre of this era embraced what became known as Neoclassicism, a movement that sought to revive and perfect the dramatic principles of ancient Greece and Rome. Unlike the exuberant, sprawling plays of Spain or England, French neoclassical drama prized restraint, order, and adherence to strict formal rules. The famous three unities, unity of action, unity of time, and unity of place, became not merely suggestions, but essential requirements for any play aspiring to literary merit. These principles dictated that a play should contain one main plot without distracting subplots, that the action should unfold within a single day, and that the setting should remain in one location throughout the performance. This emphasis on formal perfection reflected broader cultural values of the French court, where elegance, reason, and controlled expression were paramount. The theatre became a mirror of aristocratic society, polished to gleaming perfection. Violent action occurred offstage and was reported by messengers, maintaining a sense of decorum that would have seemed foreign to audiences watching blood-soaked revenge plays elsewhere in Europe. The language itself became an art form, with playwrights crafting verses in Alexandrine couplets, 12-syllable lines of poetry that rang with formal beauty. Pierre Corneille emerged as one of the first masters of this refined theatrical tradition. His play, Le Cid, first performed in 1637, caused both sensation and controversy. The work told the story of a Spanish nobleman torn between love and honor, forced to duel his beloved's father. While audiences adored the play, critics engaged in heated debates about whether it properly observed the classical unities and maintained appropriate decorum. This controversy, known as the Quarrel of Le Cid, revealed how seriously the French literary establishment took questions of dramatic form and propriety. Corneille continued writing for decades, producing tragedies that explored themes of duty, honor, and the conflicts between personal desire and public responsibility. His characters often faced impossible moral dilemmas, forced to choose between equally compelling obligations: the nobility of his heroes and heroines, their eloquent expression of internal struggle, and their ultimate triumph of will over emotion exemplified the neoclassical ideal. His verses possessed a rhetorical grandeur that audiences found both moving and intellectually satisfying. Following in Corneille's footsteps came Jean Racine, whose tragedies achieved an even greater purity of form and intensity of emotion. Racine looked particularly to Greek tragedy for inspiration, adapting stories from Euripides and other classical sources, while maintaining the strict formal requirements of French neoclassicism. His play, Phèdre, premiered in 1677, stands as perhaps the greatest achievement of French classical tragedy. The story of a queen consumed by forbidden passion for her stepson, the work compressed overwhelming emotion within the constraints of elegant verse and formal structure. Racine possessed an extraordinary ability to depict psychological torment through perfectly crafted language. His characters spoke in crystalline verses that revealed the depths of human suffering while maintaining an almost musical beauty. Unlike Corneille's heroes who could triumph through willpower, Racine's characters often found themselves helpless before the forces of fate and passion. His tragedies explored the darkness of human nature with unflinching honesty, yet always through the lens of poetic refinement. The result was drama that could devastate audiences emotionally while satisfying their appreciation for artistic perfection. While tragedy dominated the serious stage, comedy found its supreme expression in the works of Molière, whose genius transformed French theatre. Born Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, he adopted his stage name when he committed himself fully to theatrical life. Molière spent years touring the provinces with his theatre company before finally achieving success in Paris under the patronage of Louis XIV himself. He became not only France's greatest comic playwright, but also an actor, director, and theatre manager, understanding every aspect of theatrical production from the inside. Molière's comedies observed the formal requirements of Neoclassicism, while using humour to examine human folly and social pretension. His play, Tartuffe, satirized religious hypocrisy through the story of a conman who deceives a wealthy family by pretending to be pious. The work proved so controversial that it was banned for years. Yet Molière's royal connections eventually allowed it to be performed. The Misanthrope explored the contradictions of a man who claimed to hate all humanity while falling in love, examining the difficulty of living according to absolute principles in an imperfect world. In The Imaginary Invalid, Molière mocked the medical profession and those who became obsessed with their own health. The playwright himself performed the title role, and legend holds that he collapsed during a performance and passed away shortly after, in 1673. Whether entirely accurate or not, the story captured something essential about Molière's total dedication to his theatrical calling. His comedies balance sharp social observation with broad physical humor, creating works that could make audiences both laugh and think. He drew inspiration from Italian Commedia dell'arte, incorporating stock characters and comic business, while elevating the material through sophisticated dialogue and psychological insight. His servants often proved wiser than their masters, and his plays frequently challenged social hierarchies even while operating within them. The institutional structure of French theatre during this period differed significantly from the commercial theatres of England or Spain. The Comédie Française, established in 1680, created a permanent national theatre company that continues to the present day. This organization brought stability and prestige to theatrical performance, with actors receiving regular salaries and building lifelong careers. The company maintained a repertoire of classical works while introducing new plays, creating a living tradition of theatrical excellence. Theatre buildings themselves evolved to accommodate courtly tastes. While earlier French theatres had been adapted tennis courts or temporary structures, purpose-built playhouses gradually appeared, featuring indoor spaces lit by candles, perspective scenery painted on flat wings, and proscenium arches that framed the stage like a picture. The audience sat in a darkened auditorium, focusing attention on the illuminated stage in a way that enhanced the sense of entering another world governed by artistic order. Royal patronage played a crucial role in shaping French theatre. Louis XIV, the Sun King, recognized drama's power to glorify his reign and promote French culture. He attended performances regularly, commissioned works, and supported theatre companies financially. This support allowed playwrights and actors to pursue their art while knowing they served a larger national purpose. The king's taste influenced what appeared on stage, encouraging refinement and avoiding anything that might seem undignified or chaotic. As we prepare to expand our vision beyond European shore in our continuing journey through theatrical history, we carry with us the image of these candlelit French theatres, where language achieved its most polished expression and human passion found articulation through perfectly measured verses. The French neoclassical tradition demonstrated that theatrical art could achieve greatness through restraint as readily as through abundance, and that formal perfection could intensify rather than diminish emotional power. As we journey away from the grand theatres of France and the courts of European nobility, our story of theatrical art expands to embrace the wider world, where other cultures had been weaving their own magnificent traditions of dramatic performance for centuries. While European theatre evolved through its various transformations across vast oceans and distant lands, entirely different forms of theatrical expression had taken root, each reflecting the unique spiritual, cultural, and aesthetic values of their societies. Let us travel first to Japan, where theatrical traditions developed with a refinement and precision that would astonish any Western observer. In the 14th century, a form of musical drama emerged that we now know as no theatre. This elegant art form grew from earlier entertainment traditions and religious rituals, shaped profoundly by the innovations of Kanami and his son Xiami. These master artists transformed scattered performance elements into a unified dramatic form that embodied Zen Buddhist philosophy and Japanese aesthetic principles. No theatre moves with the slowness of a dream, each gesture carrying layers of meaning. The performers, traditionally all male, wear masks carved with extraordinary subtlety, capable of expressing different emotions simply through changes in angle and lighting. The main actor, called the Shite, often portrays supernatural beings, spirits or troubled souls seeking resolution. The stage itself is a thing of beauty, a simple raised platform of polished cypress wood, with a distinctive painted pine tree on the back wall, and a bridgeway extending to the side where performers make their entrances. The movement in No is so controlled, so measured, that a single crossing of the stage might take many minutes. Musicians playing traditional instruments like the flute and various drums create an atmospheric soundscape, while a chorus chants the narrative portions of the play. The costumes shimmer with rich brocades and layers of silk, creating visual poetry with every slow turn. This is theatre as meditation, as spiritual practice, as aesthetic perfection, pursued through centuries of refinement. Centuries later, in the early 17th century, another theatrical form emerged in Japan that could hardly have been more different. Kabuki theatre burst onto the scene with energy, colour, and popular appeal. Founded, according to tradition, by a shrine maiden named Okuni, who performed dances on a dry riverbed in Kyoto. Kabuki quickly evolved into an elaborate art form that captivated audiences across Japanese society. Where No is subtle and restrained, Kabuki is bold and spectacular. Actors wear striking makeup called kumadori, with dramatic patterns of red, blue, and black that identify character types and emotional states at a glance. The costumes dazzle with brilliant colors and intricate designs. The staging incorporates revolving platforms and trapdoors that allow for spectacular transformations and appearances. Musical accompaniment includes shamisen players whose plucked strings create distinctive soundscapes for the action. Kabuki actors developed a highly stylized performance technique featuring dramatic poses called mie, where the performer freezes in a powerful stance while crossing their eyes, creating moments of intense theatrical impact. The onagata, male actors specializing in female roles, achieved such mastery of feminine gesture and movement that they became arbiters of elegance in Japanese society. Kabuki plays often drew from historical events, moral tales, and stories of love and loyalty, presenting them with emotional intensity and visual grandeur. Far to the west, across the Himalayas, theatrical traditions in India trace their lineage back more than 2,000 years. Sanskrit drama, the classical theatre of ancient India, developed according to principles laid out in the Natya Shastra, an extensive treatise on dramatic art attributed to the sage Bharata. This remarkable text, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, describes every aspect of theatrical production with extraordinary detail, from stage dimensions to the subtle movements of eyebrows and fingers. Sanskrit drama combined poetry, music, dance, and elaborate gesture into a complete theatrical experience. The performances took place in temple courtyards or royal halls, presenting stories drawn from the great epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, or from the lives of gods and heroes. The playwright Kalidasa, who lived sometime around the 4th or 5th century CE, created works of such beauty and emotional depth that they continue to be celebrated today. His most famous play, Shakuntala, tells a story of love, separation, and reunion with lyrical grace. The acting in Sanskrit drama relied heavily on rasa, the evocation of specific emotional states in the audience through carefully crafted combinations of gesture, expression, and vocal delivery. Performers trained extensively in mudras, hand gestures with precise meanings, and in the subtle art of facial expression. Every raised eyebrow, every glance, every tilt of the head conveyed specific information to an audience versed in reading this rich vocabulary of movement. In China, theatrical forms evolved over many centuries, eventually culminating in what Westerners came to call Chinese opera, though it encompasses far more than what Western tradition defines as opera. The most famous form, Peking opera, crystallized in the 19th century, but drew upon theatrical traditions stretching back to the Tang dynasty and beyond. Chinese theater integrated acrobatics, martial arts, singing, dancing, and acting into performances of remarkable athleticism and artistry. The staging in traditional Chinese opera uses minimal scenery, relying instead on the performer's movements to suggest location and action. An actor walking in a circle indicates a journey of great distance. Miming the opening of a door makes the audience see a doorway where none exists. The costumes, elaborate and symbolic, use colors and designs to convey information about character and status. The makeup, like Kabuki's kumadori, follows symbolic patterns that identify heroes, villains, deities, and demons at a glance. The performance style demands years of rigorous training, as actors must master not only singing and speaking, but also complex movement patterns and often dangerous acrobatic feats. Female warriors execute spectacular kicks and flips, their long pheasant feathers swirling with each movement. Comic characters employ exaggerated gestures that transcend language barriers. The percussion-heavy music drives the action forward with crashing cymbals and resonant drums punctuating dramatic moments. These theatrical traditions from Japan, India, and China represent only a few examples of the rich dramatic arts that flourished beyond European borders. In Indonesia, shadow puppet theatre known as wayang kulit told epic tales projected on screens, the puppeteer serving as narrator, character voice, and conductor of the accompanying gamelan orchestra. In Southeast Asia, elaborate mask dances depicted stories from Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Throughout Africa, diverse performance traditions combined storytelling, music, dance, and ritual in communal celebrations that bound communities together. Each of these theatrical forms developed its own conventions, its own training methods, its own relationship between performer and audience, yet all shared that fundamental human impulse to transform space and time through performance, to embody stories that carried meaning beyond everyday experience, to create moments of beauty, laughter, terror, and transcendence through the ancient art of theatrical presentation. As we prepare to gather the threads of our long journey through theatrical history, these diverse traditions remind us that the art of theatre knows no single path, no universal form. Instead, it flowers differently in different soils, nourished by local traditions, spiritual beliefs, and aesthetic values, yet always serving that timeless human need to tell our stories, to see ourselves reflected and transformed through the magic of dramatic performance. As we settle into the quiet of this evening, having journeyed through centuries of theatrical tradition, we find ourselves at a place of gentle reflection. The story of theatre is not one that ends, but rather one that continues to unfold with each passing generation, weaving ancient threads into contemporary tapestries of performance and storytelling. When we watch a modern play or film, we may not immediately recognize the echoes of those first Greek performers who stood in the theatre of Dionysus, but they are there nonetheless. The structure of dramatic storytelling that Aeschylus helped establish, the rising tension, the climax, the resolution, remains the backbone of narratives we experience today. When a contemporary actor transforms into a character before our eyes, they participate in the same fundamental act of metamorphosis that those ancient performers achieved with their masks and elevated boots, bringing imagined lives into tangible reality for an audience gathered in shared experience. The physical spaces where we witness performances today still bear the architectural wisdom of those ancient builders who understood how to create intimacy between performer and spectator. Modern theatres, whether grand opera houses or small community stages, reflect principles discovered in those Greek amphitheaters, where every whisper could be heard by thousands. The semicircular seating arrangement, the consideration of sightlines, the acoustic properties carefully designed into performance spaces. These are gifts passed down through millennia of theatrical evolution. Even our screens, both large and small, operate according to theatrical principles established long ago. The camera has become a kind of portable proscenium, framing action and directing our attention, much as the skein once focused the gaze of Greek audiences. The close-up shot allows us the same intimate access to an actor's expression that medieval audiences experienced when performers moved among them on pageant wagons. Television series unfold in episodes, not unlike the sequential presentation of mystery play cycles that once rolled through medieval town squares. The practice of rehearsal, of refining performance through repetition and collaboration, connects today's actors with their predecessors across time. When contemporary performers gather to explore a script, to discover the rhythms of dialogue and the nuances of character, they engage in processes that would be recognizable to Shakespeare's company at the Globe. The collaborative nature of theatrical creation, the interplay between writer, director, actor, and designer, honors traditions established when theatre first emerged as a communal art form. Contemporary playwrights still wrestle with the same fundamental questions that engaged Sophocles and Euripides. How do we portray the complexities of human nature? How can drama illuminate the tensions between individual desires and social obligations? How might performance help audiences understand their own experiences more deeply? These questions transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods, revealing theatre as a constant exploration of what it means to be human. The genres established in ancient times continue to shape how we categorize and create dramatic works. Tragedy and comedy, though they have evolved and intermixed in countless ways, remain recognizable as distinct modes of storytelling. We still create works that examine serious themes and human struggles, descendants of Greek tragedy. We still craft stories designed to amuse and provoke laughter, carrying forward the tradition of comic performance that delighted audiences in Athens and Rome. Theatre's influence extends beyond formal performance spaces into aspects of daily life we might not immediately recognize as theatrical. Political debates, courtroom proceedings, religious ceremonies, and educational presentations all employ elements of stagecraft and dramatic presentation. Public speaking techniques draw upon centuries of theatrical knowledge about projection, gesture, and timing, the awareness of audience, the shaping of narrative, the conscious use of space and movement. These theatrical skills inform countless human interactions. Educational theatre continues the work begun by medieval religious drama, using performance as a means of instruction and exploration. Young people around the world discover confidence, empathy, and creative expression through theatrical participation, just as communities once gathered to present mystery plays. Schools and community centres become modern equivalents of those medieval town squares, where theatre strengthens social bonds and shared cultural values. The impulse to preserve and honour theatrical heritage manifests in the careful restoration of historic theatres, in the continued performance of classical plays, and in the study of theatrical history. Organisations dedicated to Shakespeare's work, to Greek drama, to Commedia dell'arte traditions. These efforts ensure that ancient forms remain living practices rather than mere historical curiosities. Each revival of an old play becomes a conversation between past and present, allowing contemporary audiences to experience works that have moved and challenged countless generations. Technology has expanded theatre's reach while maintaining its essential character. Recorded performances allow theatrical works to transcend the limitations of time and space, though they sacrifice the unique energy of live performance. The ephemeral nature of theatre, the fact that each performance exists only in the moment of its creation, remains one of its most distinctive qualities. No two performances are ever identical, just as no audience brings quite the same collective energy to a theatrical event. As we contemplate theatre's enduring legacy, we recognize that storytelling through dramatic performance satisfies deep human needs. We gather together to witness stories unfold because something profound happens in that communal space of imagination. When we suspend our disbelief and allow ourselves to be transported by performance, we participate in an ancient ritual of shared meaning-making. The darkness of the auditorium, the focused light on the stage, the collective attention of strangers. These elements create conditions for a unique kind of human connection. Theatre reminds us that we are storytelling creatures who make sense of our lives through narrative. The patterns we perceive in dramatic works help us recognize patterns in our own experiences. The emotions we witness portrayed on stage help us understand and process our own feelings. The conflicts and resolutions we observe in theatrical presentations offer us frameworks for contemplating the challenges we face in our daily lives. In this quiet moment, as our journey through theatrical history draws to a close, we might reflect on how performance has always been intertwined with what makes us human. From those ancient Greek festivals honoring Dionysus to the countless stages where stories unfold tonight in every corner of the world, theatre continues to fulfill its essential purpose, bringing people together to share in the profound and mysterious experience of story made manifest through living, breathing performance. The curtain may fall on individual productions, but theatre itself continues, an endless performance that began when the first person spoke words while others listened, when the first storyteller stepped into a circle of firelight and became someone else, if only for a moment. In that transformation lies theatre's eternal magic, as relevant now as it was thousands of years ago, and as necessary for human flourishing as it will surely remain for generations yet to come. As we bring to a close our journey through the art of theatre, from the sun-drenched stones of ancient amphitheaters to the candlelit stages of medieval performance, we hope these stories of human creativity and expression have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.